The history you memorized was curated, not by accident. Someone decided what you'd believe, what you'd question, and what you'd never hear at all. Here are 101 times they got it wrong, or made sure you would. 1. Every textbook you ever read handed you the same clean story. 2 bombs, 1 surrender, war over. Japan saw the destruction, calculated the math, and gave up. Neat, logical, and almost entirely incomplete. Declassified documents and Japanese Imperial War Council records tell a considerably more complicated story, and the part that got left out involves the Soviet Union. Japan's Supreme War Council had been deadlocked over surrender for months before Hiroshima. The bomb alone did not break that deadlock. What broke it was August 8th, 1945, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and immediately invaded Manchuria. An event that happened between the 2 bombings and eliminated Japan's last strategic hope of negotiating peace through Moscow. Emperor Hirohito's surrender address explicitly cited a new and most cruel bomb, which gave the U.S. government a usable narrative. But historians, including Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, have argued at length that Soviet entry into the Pacific War was the more decisive shock to Japan's leadership. The U.S. government had every strategic reason to emphasize the bomb. It justified the Manhattan Project's $2 billion price tag and established nuclear dominance heading into the Cold War. You were handed a 2-bomb story because we also terrified them with Russia doesn't look as clean on a war memorial. 2. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, found a new world, changed everything, and you've been repeating that sentence ever since, like it's gospel. Here's what your geography class quietly skipped. Columbus never set foot on the North American mainland, died convinced he had reached Asia, and was beaten to the Western Hemisphere by roughly 500 years. Norse explorer Leif Erikson established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, around 1000 CE, a fact confirmed by archaeological excavation in the 1960s, not by legend or assumption. Indigenous populations had been living across the Americas for at least 15,000 years before any European showed up with a flag and a claim. The Columbus discovery myth wasn't ancient tradition. It was substantially constructed by Washington Irving's fictionalized 1828 biography, written to give the young United States a founding hero with European legitimacy. Irving invented details, dramatized scenes, and produced something closer to historical fiction than biography. That fiction became the textbook. Crediting Columbus with discovering America is like crediting the second person to arrive at a party with inventing the venue. The guests had been there for millennia before he knocked. 3. You've been laughing at short men your entire life using a dead French emperor as the punchline, and the entire joke is built on a unit of measurement nobody bothered to convert. Napoleon Bonaparte, standing at 5'2", is one of history's most confidently repeated facts, and it is wrong. The confusion originated from a fundamental discrepancy between French and English measurement units. His recorded height of 5 feet 2 inches was measured in French inches, which are longer than imperial inches. Convert properly, and Napoleon stood approximately 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, average to slightly above average for a Frenchman of his era. The British did the rest. Wartime propaganda, particularly the work of cartoonist James Gilray, deliberately depicted Napoleon as tiny to mock and diminish an enemy they genuinely feared. Those caricatures spread across Europe and calcified into assumed fact. His nickname among his own troops was Le Petit Caporal, an affectionate term of camaraderie, not a comment on anyone's height. His personal guards were required to be exceptionally tall, which made him appear shorter by constant comparison. Britain ran a 200-year disinformation campaign about a man's physical stature. It worked perfectly, and you named a psychological disorder after it. 4. You probably repeated this one in a school report. The Great Wall of China is so massive, so incomprehensibly vast that it can be seen from space with the naked eye. It's been in geography textbooks, travel brochures, and casual conversation for decades. Multiple astronauts, including Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, have confirmed they could not see it from low Earth orbit. The wall averages only about 15 to 30 feet wide. That is far too narrow to resolve with the naked human eye from 250 miles up, regardless of how long it stretches horizontally. NASA has confirmed that no human-made structure is reliably visible from the moon, and the Great Wall ranks among the least visible even from low orbit. The myth appears to have originated as early as 1932 in Ripley's Believe It or Not, published decades before humans had ever left the atmosphere. It was pure speculation presented as established fact, and it got copied into educational materials before anyone could actually go up and check. Under ideal conditions, with cameras and optical aids, portions have been photographed from orbit, which is how the myth survives. A camera with a zoom lens confirmed it, but human eyes cannot. You put this claim in children's books before anyone had left the planet, which is a breathtaking level of confidence in a rumor. 5. Every motivational speaker who has ever stood in front of a whiteboard has told you this story. Even Einstein failed math as a child. If a genius struggled, there's hope for all of us. Set aside for a moment how deeply that story relies on Einstein having been bad at something. Because he wasn't. Einstein himself directly addressed this myth and stated that he had mastered calculus before age 15. He found mathematics trivially easy from an early age and was working through algebra and geometry textbooks well ahead of his peers by age 12. The confusion arose from a reversal of the Swiss grading system. In Switzerland, 6 was the top grade and 1 was the lowest, the precise opposite of many other systems. Early reports of his high scores were misread as failures by people who didn't check how Swiss grading worked, and the error spread because it was emotionally irresistible. The Einstein failed math myth persists not because anyone verified it, but because it is useful. Struggling students need a famous failure to identify with, and motivational speakers need a hook that fits in an opening anecdote. The most famous supposed proof that failure leads to genius is itself a failure of basic fact-checking, which is almost too perfectly ironic to correct. 6. When you picture the Salem witch trials, you probably picture fire. Puritans, stakes, flames, the whole cinematic package. Every haunted house, every Halloween display, every dramatic recreation defaults to burning. Not a single person was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. 19 people were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones placed on his chest over 2 days in an attempt to force him to enter a plea. He refused to the end. Several others died in prison awaiting trial. Burning at the stake was associated with witch trials in continental Europe, particularly Germany and France, where church and secular courts used fire as the prescribed method of execution. It was never the legal method used in colonial Massachusetts. The conflation of Salem with burning has been significantly reinforced by films, television productions, and artwork that borrowed European visual imagery and applied it wholesale to an American event. The actual Salem trials resulted from a combination of mass hysteria, local land disputes, Puritan theological anxiety, and the testimony of a small group of adolescent girls beginning in early 1692. We misremembered the method of execution for one of America's most thoroughly documented historical events, which should make you wonder considerably harder about everything else. 7. The term Dark Ages gets used constantly to describe roughly 1,000 years of European history as a wasteland of superstition, plague, and intellectual stagnation between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. It is one of the laziest labels in historical shorthand, and it was invented by people with an obvious agenda. Renaissance scholars coined the darkness metaphor specifically to make their own era look like a glorious rebirth. It was a marketing device, not a historical assessment. The medieval period produced foundational advances in agriculture, law, architecture, and science. The heavy plow, three-field crop rotation, and the horse collar, all developed or widely adopted during the medieval period, dramatically increased agricultural output and population across Europe. Scholars like Roger Bacon wrote about empirical observation and experimentation in the 13th century, directly prefiguring the scientific revolution by several hundred years. Gothic cathedrals represent extraordinary feats of structural engineering. The flying buttress solved load-bearing problems that had stumped builders for centuries. The term Dark Ages was coined by Petrarch in the 14th century to flatter his own moment by darkening everything that came before. You've been using a competitor's advertising copy as your history framework, and the product being sold was Renaissance-era self-promotion. 8. You've heard this one so many times, it feels like basic biology. You only use 10% of your brain. Unlock the other 90%, and you become superhuman. The film industry built entire plots around it. Self-help books have generated fortunes from the premise. Brain imaging technology has made the entire claim impossible to maintain. PET scans and functional MRI imaging demonstrate that over the course of a single day, essentially 100% of the brain shows metabolic activity. No dormant 90% exists waiting to be switched on. From an evolutionary standpoint alone, the myth collapses instantly. The brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy supply, despite being only 2% of body weight. Evolution does not maintain an organ consuming that much fuel if 90% of it is doing nothing. The myth's exact origin is unclear, but traces likely to misquotations of William James. Early misunderstandings of the difference between glial cells and neurons, or preliminary neuroscience that could only detect actively firing neurons, and concluded the rest was idle. The films Lucy and Limitless both built full narratives around this premise and collectively assured another generation that it was plausible science. The 10% myth is most popular among people who apparently used very little of their full brain capacity to fact-check it. 9. The Titanic is history's most famous cautionary tale about human arrogance. Overconfident engineers declared the ship unsinkable. Hubris collided with an iceberg, and the universe delivered its verdict in 3 hours and 40 minutes. The problem with this story is that White Star Line never officially called the Titanic unsinkable in any major pre-voyage marketing campaign. The unsinkable narrative was largely constructed after the disaster. White Star Line's promotional materials emphasized luxury and scale, not invincibility. The word unsinkable does not appear in their official literature. A single trade publication called The Shipbuilder described the watertight compartment system as making the ship practically unsinkable. A qualified engineering claim about a specific feature, not a corporate boast from the shipping company. The unsinkable mythology was primarily created and amplified by newspaper coverage after the sinking, as journalists needed a narrative frame that explained why so many people died. Lifeboats were reduced in number, not through arrogance, but due to deck aesthetics and outdated maritime regulations. The ship technically exceeded legal minimums at the time. You needed the hubris to make the tragedy feel like justice. Regulatory failure and cost-cutting doesn't carry the same weight as a civilization that thought itself too clever to sink. 10. If you have ever seen a historical drama involving Vikings, you saw the helmets. Horned, dramatic, sitting atop fur-clad warriors ready to sack a coastal village. The helmet is so universal that it defines the entire visual identity of an entire civilization. No horned helmet has ever been found in a Viking archaeological context. The single most famous horned helmet artifact predates the Viking Age by over 1,000 years. The Vexo helmets, discovered in a Danish bog in 1942, feature horns and are visually striking. They also date to approximately 900 BCE, placing them firmly in the Bronze Age, roughly 2 millennia before the Viking period began. Actual Viking Age helmets recovered in archaeological digs are rounded iron or leather caps, frequently with a simple nose guard, functional and undecorated. The horned helmet image was popularized by 19th century Romantic artists and costume designers, particularly for operatic productions of Norse mythology, including Wagner's Ring Cycle. From opera costuming to historical assumption in a single generation. Beyond the archaeological problem, wearing horned helmets in actual combat would have been extraordinarily impractical. The horns create leverage points enemies could grab to control or unseat a fighter. An entire civilization's visual identity was designed by 19th century opera departments, and the history profession has spent decades failing to correct it. 11. You know the image. Rome in flames. Nero on his balcony, playing music, completely indifferent to the catastrophe below. The definitive portrait of leadership so decadent it watched its own empire burn. The fiddle did not exist in ancient Rome. The violin family of instruments was developed in medieval Europe, more than 1,000 years after Nero's reign. Whatever Nero was or wasn't doing during the fire of 64 CE, he was not playing an instrument that wouldn't be invented for another millennium. Ancient historian Tacitus, who was generally critical of Nero, wrote that Nero opened his palace grounds to displaced refugees and organized food distribution from the port city of Ostia during the disaster. The fiddling claim appears to trace back to Suetonius, a writer known for sensationalism, who was composing his account decades after the event. Suetonius claimed Nero sang from a tower while viewing the fire, not fiddled, and not from a balcony. Nero himself was suspected of starting the fire, a claim that has never been substantiated by contemporary evidence, and modern historians believe the fire most likely started accidentally in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus. We invented an impossible instrument and gave it to a man who may have actually organized relief efforts, because the rescue operation version doesn't circulate as well. 12. Every dramatic documentary about ancient history has shown you the same scene. The Library of Alexandria, consumed by fire in a single catastrophic night. Centuries of accumulated human knowledge, reduced to ash in hours. A civilizational wound so severe it set humanity back 1,000 years. The Library of Alexandria declined gradually over centuries due to a combination of funding cuts, neglect, and a series of partial destructions. Not one dramatic burning. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE may have burned a warehouse of books near the harbor, not the main library. And the two locations are routinely conflated. The institution suffered further damage under Roman Emperor Aurelian's attack in the 270s CE, and again during Diocletian's siege in 297 CE. The library had likely already declined significantly by the time of the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE, the event most popularly blamed for the destruction. Historian Luciano Canfora has argued that the library essentially faded through centuries of Roman imperial neglect and reduced royal patronage. Institutions die from budget cuts and administrative indifference far more commonly than from fire. The story of one dramatic burning is more satisfying than the story of slow institutional defunding. That preference for the dramatic version over the accurate one is itself a lesson the library's destruction should have taught you. 13. The rats did it. That is the story. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. Plague moved from city to city and killed roughly a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. Clean transmission chain. Settled science. The rat-flea model alone cannot account for the speed and geographic spread of the Black Death's devastation across 14th century Europe, and scientists have been saying so in peer-reviewed literature for years. A 2018 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used mathematical modeling to argue that human fleas and body lice, not rat fleas, were the primary transmission vector in medieval European plague outbreaks. The speed of spread through regions with cold climates where rat populations would have been minimal challenges, the rat-centric explanation in ways that don't get discussed in popular accounts. Some historians and scientists have proposed that pneumonic plague, spread through respiratory droplets, played a substantially larger role than the bubonic form typically associated with flea bites, particularly in explaining transmission rates in colder northern regions. DNA evidence from medieval plague victims has confirmed Yersinia pestis as the causative bacterium. How it moved between people at the speed it moved through the populations it devastated remains an active area of scholarly debate that the popular Rats Did It summary quietly omits. 14. George Washington. Wooden teeth. Cherry tree. Cannot tell a lie. The dentures are as foundational to the founding father mythology as the powdered wig. His dentures were never made of wood. Not once. Forensic analysis of surviving Washington dentures held at the Mount Vernon estate found them constructed from ivory from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, human teeth, animal teeth from cows and horses, and a metal alloy base. No wood anywhere in the material record. The wooden myth likely originated from the staining and grain-like texture that ivory develops over time, causing casual observers to misidentify the material at a glance. Washington lost most of his teeth throughout his adult life, which forensic and historical evidence suggests was significantly accelerated by mercury chloride treatments he received for various illnesses. A standard 18th century medical practice that was genuinely effective against some infections and genuinely destructive to dental tissue. He wore dentures through most of his presidency, and they visibly affected his appearance. Portraits from his later years show his jaw pushed unnaturally outward by ill-fitting appliances. The wooden teeth myth is a comfortable misdirection from the more significant material detail. Historical and forensic analysis indicates the dentures included human teeth, sourced in ways consistent with the institution of slavery that operated on Washington's estate. That detail deserves to be in the textbooks considerably more than the Wood story does. 15. The moon landing conspiracy is the most resilient myth in the modern era. Soundstages, Stanley Kubrick, the flag rippling in a vacuum, photographs with suspicious shadows. The argument that the U.S. government faked the Apollo 11 moon landing has been circulating since before the lunar dust had settled. The Soviet Union tracked Apollo 11 with their own completely independent deep space monitoring systems and never disputed the landing. This single fact should end the conversation. The USSR had beaten the United States in multiple early space milestones. First satellite, first human in orbit, first spacewalk, and had every geopolitical incentive to expose a fabricated moon landing. They had the technical capability to detect the deception. They said nothing, because there was nothing to expose. Retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface by Apollo astronauts during the missions are still in active use today. Any observatory with a sufficiently powerful laser can bounce a signal off them and receive a return. And hundreds of research institutions worldwide do exactly that. Over 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program across government agencies and private contractors. A conspiracy of that scale, maintained without a single credible whistleblower for more than 50 years, would represent the greatest institutional secret-keeping achievement in the history of organized human activity. The nation with the most to gain from exposing it confirmed it was real. That should carry more weight than a Reddit thread. 16. Einstein. E equals mc squared. Peaceful genius. Pacifist who stood apart from the violence of the 20th century and had nothing to do with the weapon that defined it. This version of Einstein is comforting, coherent, and significantly incomplete. Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt in August 1939, co-authored with physicist Leo Szilard, explicitly warned that nuclear chain reactions in large masses of uranium could produce enormous amounts of power and potentially bombs of a new type. And it urged the US government to secure uranium supplies and accelerate nuclear research. Roosevelt received the letter in October 1939 and established the Advisory Committee on Uranium shortly after. That committee became the organizational precursor to the Manhattan Project. Einstein himself was barred from working on the Manhattan Project because Army security considered his political associations a liability. He learned about the Hiroshima bombing from a radio broadcast, the same way everyone else did. After the bombing, Einstein stated publicly that signing the letter to Roosevelt was the great mistake of his life, while also maintaining that he would have signed it again given the genuine fear of German nuclear weapons development in 1939. His famous equation provided the theoretical framework for understanding nuclear energy release, though engineering an actual weapon required decades of additional physics and industrial effort. The pacifist physicist wrote the letter that launched the nuclear age, was then considered too politically unreliable to participate in it, and found out it had worked the same way the rest of the world did. 17. You were taught in school that the Americas were populated by people who walked across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Clean, linear, settled. One route, one migration, humanity spreading south and eventually filling 2 continents. Multiple lines of genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence now suggest the Americas were populated in several waves by multiple routes, potentially including Pacific coastal routes, and contacts that predate any period when the inland Bering Corridor was passable on foot. The Monte Verde site in Chile has been dated to approximately 14,500 BCE, before the inland Bering route was navigable, which requires an explanation that doesn't involve walking through a land corridor that didn't exist yet. A Pacific coastal migration using watercraft is the leading alternative hypothesis. Genetic studies published between 2015 and 2021 identified ancestry patterns in certain Amazonian populations that don't fit cleanly into a single Bering land bridge migration model, pointing toward a more complex founding population structure. Linguistic diversity among indigenous American languages is so extraordinary, representing dozens of completely unrelated language families, that some linguists argue it could only have developed through multiple separate migrations over tens of thousands of years. The "they walked across a bridge" story was the textbook answer for a century, because it was the simplest one available, and the actual human history of 2 continents is apparently far more complicated and interesting than a single paragraph ever allowed. 18. The most comforting myth in academic history is the one your teachers told you without checking a single source. Even Einstein failed math, so there's hope for all of us. The problem is that this story requires Einstein to have been bad at something, and he wasn't. Einstein himself directly addressed this myth and stated that he had mastered calculus before age 15. He found mathematics straightforward from an early age and was working independently through algebra and geometry textbooks well ahead of his peers by age 12. The confusion arose from a reversal of the Swiss grading system. In Switzerland, 6 was the top grade and 1 was the lowest, the precise opposite of many other national systems. Early reports of his high scores were misread as failures by people who didn't verify how Swiss grading worked, and the error spread because it was emotionally useful rather than factually supportable. The myth persists not because anyone verified it, but because it serves a purpose. Struggling students need a famous name attached to early failure, and the story gets recycled in motivational contexts without scrutiny. The most celebrated supposed proof that failure produces genius is itself a failure of basic fact-checking, which is almost too perfectly constructed to correct. 19. When you picture the Salem witch trials, you picture fire, stakes, flames, Puritans, the full dramatic tableau. Every haunted house, every Halloween display, every television recreation defaults to burning. Not a single person was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. 19 people were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones placed on his chest over 2 days in an attempt to force him to enter a plea. He refused until the end. Several others died in prison awaiting trial. Burning at the stake was the prescribed method in continental Europe, particularly in German and French jurisdictions, where church and secular courts operated under different legal traditions than colonial Massachusetts. The conflation of Salem with burning has been reinforced for decades by films, television productions, and theatrical works that borrowed European visual imagery and transplanted it wholesale onto an American event with completely different legal procedures. The actual Salem trials emerged from a specific combination of mass hysteria, local land disputes, Puritan theological anxiety, and testimony from a small group of adolescent girls beginning in early 1692. You misremembered the method of execution for one of your country's most thoroughly documented historical events, which should adjust your confidence level on everything less documented. 20. The term Dark Ages gets deployed constantly to describe roughly 1,000 years of European history as intellectual stagnation sandwiched between Rome's collapse and the Renaissance. It is one of the most persistent labels in historical shorthand, and it was invented by people with an obvious self-promotional agenda. Renaissance scholars coined the darkness metaphor specifically to make their own era appear as a glorious civilizational rebirth by contrast. It was marketing, not assessment. The medieval period produced foundational advances in agriculture, law, architecture, and natural philosophy. The heavy plow, three-field crop rotation, and the horse collar, all developed or widely adopted during this supposedly dark period, dramatically increased agricultural output and sustained growing European populations. Roger Bacon wrote about empirical observation and systematic experimentation in the 13th century, directly anticipating the scientific revolution by several centuries. Gothic cathedrals represent extraordinary structural engineering achievements. The flying buttress solved load-bearing problems that had defeated builders for generations. The word Dark Ages was coined by Petrarch in the 14th century to flatter his own moment by obscuring everything preceding it. You have been using a competitor's advertising copy as your historical framework, and the product being promoted was Renaissance-era self-congratulation, dressed as scholarship. 21. You have heard this claim so many times, it registers as established biology. You use only 10% of your brain, and somewhere inside your skull sits an untapped 90% of potential waiting to be unlocked. The film industry has built profitable franchises around this premise. Brain imaging technology has made the entire claim untenable. PET scans and functional MRI imaging demonstrate that over the course of any given day, essentially the full brain shows metabolic activity. There is no dormant 90% sitting idle. The evolutionary argument alone is sufficient to dismiss it. The brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy supply, despite comprising only about 2% of body weight. Evolution does not sustain an organ burning that much fuel if 90% of it contributes nothing. The myth likely traces to misattributed quotations, early misunderstandings of the functional difference between glial cells and neurons, or preliminary neuroscience methods that could only detect actively firing neurons, and incorrectly concluded the remainder was inactive. 2 major studio films in the 21st century built their entire plots around this premise and ensured another generation absorbed it as plausible science. The 10% myth travels furthest among people who apparently applied very little of their full neural capacity to questioning it. 22. The Titanic gets taught as history's definitive lesson in human arrogance. Engineers declared the ship unsinkable. The ship met an iceberg, and the universe settled the argument in under 4 hours. It is a satisfying narrative that rests on something White Star Line never actually said in any official capacity. Their promotional materials emphasized the ship's scale and luxury, not invincibility. The word unsinkable does not appear in their official literature. A single trade publication called The Ship Builder described the watertight compartment system as making the vessel practically unsinkable. A qualified engineering observation about one specific design feature, not a marketing boast from the company operating the ship. The mythology of corporate arrogance was primarily assembled by newspaper coverage after the sinking, as journalists needed a narrative framework that could explain why over 1,500 people died. Lifeboats were reduced in number, not through arrogance, but through a combination of deck space aesthetic decisions and maritime regulations the ship technically exceeded. The hubris story was constructed because disasters require someone to have been overconfident. Outdated regulations and cost-based design decisions is accurate, but generates considerably less moral clarity than a civilization that thought itself too sophisticated to drown. 23. Every depiction of Vikings you have ever seen gives them the same helmet. Horned, dramatic, sitting above a fur collar on a warrior prepared to burn a monastery. The helmet is so ubiquitous it has become the defining visual symbol of an entire civilization. No horned helmet has been found in any Viking-era archaeological context. The single most famous artifact featuring horns on a helmet, the Vexo helmets, discovered in a Danish bog in 1942, dates to approximately 900 BCE, placing it firmly in the Bronze Age, roughly 2 millennia before the Viking period began. Actual helmets recovered from Viking Age sites are rounded iron or leather caps, frequently featuring a simple nose guard. Functional, unadorned, practical. The horned helmet image was invented by 19th century Romantic artists and stage designers, particularly those producing operatic performances of Norse mythology, including Wagner's Ring Cycle. The imagery migrated from opera costuming into historical assumption within a single generation. Setting aside archaeology, wearing horned helmets in combat would have been practically suicidal. The horns provide an enemy with leverage points to grab, redirect, and control a fighter's head movement. An entire civilization's identity was designed by 19th century theatrical costume departments, and the error has been reproducing unchallenged on merchandise ever since. 24. You know the image. Nero on an elevated position overlooking Rome, playing music while the city burned below him. The definitive portrait of governance so detached from consequence that it could watch its own civilization become ash and find the moment worth accompanying with a melody. The fiddle did not exist in ancient Rome. The violin family of instruments was developed in medieval Europe, more than 1,000 years after Nero's death. Whatever Nero was or wasn't doing during the fire of 64 CE, he was physically incapable of playing an instrument that hadn't been invented yet. The historian Tacitus, generally no admirer of Nero, wrote that Nero opened his palace grounds to refugees displaced by the fire and organized food supply operations from the port at Ostia. The playing music claim traces to Suetonius, a writer composing his account decades after the events and known for prioritizing dramatic effect. Suetonius described singing, not fiddling, from a tower. Nero has also been accused of starting the fire deliberately, a claim modern historians largely consider unsupported by contemporary evidence. We invented an anachronistic instrument, assigned it to a man who may have actually organized disaster relief, and built the image because imperial indifference makes a better story than imperial logistics. 25. Every dramatic documentary about ancient knowledge has shown you the same scene. The Library of Alexandria consumed by fire in a single catastrophic night. Centuries of accumulated human understanding reduced to ash in hours. A wound so deep it supposedly set humanity's intellectual progress back by 1,000 years. The Library of Alexandria declined gradually across multiple centuries through a combination of funding reductions, administrative neglect, and a series of partial destructions. Not one dramatic conflagration. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE likely burned a warehouse near the harbor rather than the main library, but the two locations have been routinely conflated ever since. The institution suffered further documented damage under Aurelian in the 270s CE, and again during Diocletian's siege in 297 CE. The library had, in all probability, already declined substantially by the time of the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE, the event most commonly blamed in popular accounts. Historian Luciano Canfora has argued the library faded through centuries of reduced royal funding and Roman imperial indifference. Institutions collapse from neglect and budget decisions far more commonly than from fire. The single dramatic burning is more emotionally satisfying than slow institutional defunding. That preference for the satisfying version over the accurate one is, appropriately enough, exactly what the library's story should have taught you to question. 26. The rats did it. That is the summary version of the Black Death's transmission that survived into popular understanding. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. Plague moved between cities and killed approximately a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. The rat-flea model alone cannot account for the speed and geographic distribution of 14th century plague mortality, and researchers have been documenting the discrepancy in peer-reviewed literature for years. A 2018 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used mathematical modeling to argue that human fleas and body lice, not rat fleas, were the primary transmission vector in medieval European outbreaks. The speed of spread through cold northern regions, where rat populations would have been limited, presents a particular challenge to the rat-centric explanation that popular accounts consistently omit. Some researchers have proposed that pneumonic plague, transmitted through respiratory droplets, played a far larger role than the bubonic form typically associated with flea bites, particularly in explaining transmission rates during winter months in northern Europe. DNA evidence from medieval victims has confirmed Yersinia pestis as the causative organism. How it moved between human populations at the speed and scale it did remains an actively debated question that the confident rats did it summary quietly closes before it should. 27. George Washington's wooden teeth are as foundational to the founding father mythology as the cherry tree and the inability to tell a lie. The dentures are repeated in children's books, comedy routines, and casual historical references as settled biographical fact. His dentures were never made of wood. Forensic analysis of surviving Washington dentures held at the Mount Vernon estate found them constructed from hippopotamus and elephant ivory, human teeth, animal teeth from cows and horses, and a metal alloy base. No wood appears anywhere in the material record. The wooden appearance of ivory over time, as it stains, ages, and develops a grain-like texture, likely caused casual observers to misidentify the material at a glance, and the misidentification replicated through retelling. Washington lost most of his teeth throughout his adult life, a process forensic and historical evidence suggests was significantly accelerated by mercury chloride treatments he received for various illnesses. A standard 18th century medical practice, effective against some infections and genuinely destructive to dental tissue as a documented side effect. The wooden teeth myth functions as a harmless curiosity in textbooks. The more significant material detail, that forensic analysis indicates the dentures included human teeth consistent with sourcing from the enslaved population at his estate, deserves considerably more textbook space than the wood story has ever occupied. 28. The moon landing conspiracy is the most persistent myth in the modern information environment. Sound stages, suspicious shadows in photographs, a flag moving in a vacuum, the implication that Stanley Kubrick filmed the whole thing on a studio set. The Soviet Union tracked Apollo 11 using their own completely independent deep space monitoring network and never disputed the landing. That single fact should settle the argument. The USSR had beaten the United States to multiple early space milestones: first satellite, first human in orbit, first spacewalk, and possessed every geopolitical incentive to expose a fabricated mission. They had the technical capability to detect the deception in real time. They said nothing, because there was nothing to expose. Retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface during the Apollo missions are still in active scientific use today. Observatories worldwide bounce laser signals off them and receive confirmed returns. Over 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program across government agencies and private contractors spanning more than a decade. A conspiracy of that scale, maintained without a single credible whistleblower across more than 50 years, would represent the most successful institutional secret in human history. The nation with the greatest motivation to expose a fabrication confirmed the landing was genuine. You should weigh that more heavily than you currently do. 29. Einstein the pacifist stands apart from the defining violence of the 20th century. A theoretical physicist whose contributions to human understanding existed on a plane separate from the weapons that reshaped civilization. This version of Einstein is emotionally coherent and significantly incomplete. The letter Einstein co-authored with physicist Leo Szilard and delivered to President Roosevelt in August 1939 explicitly warned that nuclear chain reactions in uranium could produce weapons of extraordinary destructive power, and urged the U.S. government to secure uranium supplies and accelerate its own research program. Roosevelt received the letter in October 1939 and established the Advisory Committee on Uranium shortly afterward, the organizational precursor to what became the Manhattan Project. Einstein himself was barred from working on the Manhattan Project because Army security considered his political associations a disqualifying liability. He learned about the Hiroshima bombing from a radio broadcast. After the bombing, Einstein stated publicly that signing the letter was the great mistake of his life, while also acknowledging he would have signed it again given the genuine fear of German nuclear weapons development that existed in 1939. His equation provided the theoretical basis for understanding nuclear energy conversion. The pacifist physicist wrote the letter that initiated the nuclear arms race, was then deemed too politically unreliable to participate in it, and found out it had succeeded the same way the rest of the world did. 30. The Americas were populated by people who walked across a land bridge from Siberia during the last ice age. One route, one migration, humanity spreading south until it filled 2 continents. Clean, linear, resolved, multiple independent lines of genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence now indicate the Americas were settled through several waves by multiple routes, potentially including Pacific coastal pathways and population movements that predate any period when the inland Bering Corridor was navigable on foot. The Monte Verde archaeological site in Chile has been dated to approximately 14,500 BCE, before the inland Bering route was geographically accessible, which requires an explanation that the single land bridge model cannot provide. A Pacific coastal migration using watercraft is the leading alternative hypothesis for early settlement of the Southern Hemisphere. Genetic studies published between 2015 and 2021 identified ancestry signatures in certain Amazonian populations that don't fit cleanly into a single founding migration event, pointing toward a more structurally complex picture of who arrived, when, and from where. Linguistic diversity across indigenous American languages, representing dozens of completely unrelated language families, is so extraordinary that some researchers argue it could only have accumulated through multiple separate migrations across tens of thousands of years. The land bridge story was the textbook answer for a century because it was the simplest one available, not necessarily the most accurate. 31. The medieval Catholic Church gets cast as the primary institutional obstacle between humanity and scientific progress. Burning heretics, silencing astronomers, keeping Europe in superstitious darkness while knowledge waited patiently for the Enlightenment to rescue it. The medieval Catholic Church was the primary institutional funder and physical host of scientific inquiry in Europe for centuries. The university system itself was a church invention. Bologna in 1088, Oxford around 1096, Paris around 1150. and these institutions housed Europe's most advanced work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Gregor Mendel, whose pea plant experiments in the 1850s and 60s produced the foundational principles of modern genetics, was an Augustinian friar. His research was conducted inside a monastery and funded by the institutional resources of religious life. The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 was a papal initiative driven specifically by astronomical precision. Pope Gregory III commissioned leading mathematicians and astronomers to correct the drift accumulating in the Julian calendar. Galileo's conflict with church authority was substantially political and interpersonal in character. He had powerful church allies. His theory lacked the proof required to overturn established cosmology, and he publicly insulted the Pope in a published dialogue. The institution blamed for suppressing science built the universities where science was conducted, which is the kind of historical detail that complicates a clean narrative. 32. Democrats and Republicans. The binary that defines American political life. Two parties, two choices. The way it has always been, and, by strong implication, the way it must always remain. The Republican Party did not exist until 1854. Before that, the dominant opposition to the Democrats was the Whig Party, which produced 4 American presidents before collapsing entirely over the question of slavery in the early 1850s. Before the Whigs, the primary political divide was between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and the Federalist Party collapsed completely by 1820, leaving a brief period of effectively one-party governance that historians call the era of good feelings. The United States has had at least 5 distinct party systems since its founding, with major parties rising, fracturing, and being replaced by entirely new coalitions within single generations. Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party in 1912 actually outpolled the Republican Party in that election. Third parties have cracked the system before. The current two-party structure is maintained through specific mechanisms: first past the post voting, state-level ballot access laws that vary significantly in their restrictiveness, and campaign finance architecture that advantages established parties. None of these are constitutional requirements. The two parties you are told have always existed replace 2 completely different parties that also, in their time, claim to be permanent fixtures. 33. Fleming found the mold. That is the story's beginning, middle, and end in most popular accounts. Alexander Fleming, a contaminated petri dish in 1928, the accidental observation that changed medicine. The drug that has saved hundreds of millions of lives was developed into a clinically usable form over the following decade by 2 other scientists who received a fraction of the historical credit. Fleming observed that penicillium mold inhibited bacterial growth in his laboratory, but concluded the substance was too chemically unstable and difficult to produce in therapeutically useful quantities. He largely abandoned active pursuit of the research by 1931. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain at Oxford University spent years from 1938 onward purifying penicillin, stabilizing it sufficiently for clinical use, and conducting the first human trials in 1941. The drug that reached Allied soldiers by the end of World War II was the product of that decade of painstaking chemical and pharmacological work, not the afternoon observation that preceded it. Mass production further required a major American industrial and government mobilization effort. Penicillin as medicine was as much a manufacturing achievement as a scientific one. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the 1945 Nobel Prize, but public memory assigned the story almost entirely to the man who made the observation and then walked away from it. 34. The ancient Olympics get described as a noble celebration of pure athletic competition. Greek athletes honoring the gods, representing their city-states in a spirit of honest sportsmanship that modern games aspire to recover. The ancient Olympics were politically entangled, frequently corrupt, and explicitly exclusionary in ways that the idealized version omits entirely. married women were barred from attending the games under penalty of death. Only the priestess of Demeter was granted an exception by established tradition. The Greek writer Pausanias documented a notable row of bronze statues at Olympia called Zanes, erected using fines collected from athletes caught bribing opponents or judges. There were enough of these penalty monuments to form a recognizable walkway, which suggests bribery was not an occasional aberration. City-states routinely offered substantial financial rewards to their victorious athletes. Solon of Athens set the prize for Olympic victory at 500 drachmas, approximately 500 days of wages for a skilled worker, making athletic competition an explicitly commercial enterprise. The games were restricted to Greek citizens, and the definition of Greek citizenship was itself politically contested and manipulated to include or exclude athletes according to convenience. The Olympics you romanticize as pure idealism had bribery monuments, prize money, a formal exclusion policy, and an execution provision for female spectators, which makes them considerably closer to modern professional sports than the founding myth suggests. 35. The CIA's MKUltra program gets filed in popular memory as a Cold War aberration. A handful of rogue scientists, a brief period of sanction madness, exposed and shut down before too much damage was done. MKUltra was a large, multi-institutional program that ran for over 2 decades, involved at least 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons, and its records were deliberately destroyed before congressional investigators could document its full scope. The program operated from 1953 to at least 1973 under CIA Director Richard Helms, who ordered the destruction of most program files in 1973 when he learned a congressional investigation was approaching. What investigators eventually found was based on a cache of documents accidentally preserved in a financial records building that escaped the purge. The program administered LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, and other substances to unwitting subjects including prisoners, mental patients, and CIA employees. At least one documented death resulted, Frank Olson in 1953, following an unsanctioned dosing. Over 150 human research projects were conducted at institutions including Harvard University, Stanford University, and Massachusetts General Hospital. The government ran a mind control program for 2 decades using your most prestigious universities, then destroyed the evidence. What you know about it is only what survived the shredding. 36. Einstein the pacifist stands entirely apart from the weapon that defined the 20th century. A theoretical physicist whose work existed on a plane separate from the violence it eventually enabled. This framing requires you to ignore a specific letter dated August 2nd, 1939. Einstein co-authored that letter with physicist Leo Szilard and addressed it directly to President Roosevelt, warning that nuclear chain reactions in large quantities of uranium could generate enormous power and potentially weapons of a destructive scale not previously seen, and explicitly urging the U.S. government to secure uranium supplies and accelerate nuclear research. Roosevelt received it in October 1939 and established the Advisory Committee on Uranium shortly afterward, the organizational precursor to what became the Manhattan Project. Einstein himself was subsequently barred from working on the program because Army security considered his political associations a disqualifying risk. He learned Hiroshima had been bombed from a radio broadcast, the same way everyone else did. After the bombing, Einstein stated publicly that signing the letter was the great mistake of his life, while acknowledging he would have signed it again, given the genuine fear of German nuclear development in 1939. The pacifist physicist initiated the nuclear age, was then deemed too politically suspect to participate in it, and found out it had worked on the radio. 37. You were taught that the Americas were populated by people who walked across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. One route, one founding migration, humanity spreading south until it eventually filled 2 continents. Multiple independent lines of genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence now indicate the picture is considerably more complicated than a single corridor and a single movement of people. The Monte Verde site in southern Chile has been reliably dated to approximately 14,500 BCE, before the inland-bearing corridor was geographically passable on foot, which requires an explanation that the single land bridge model cannot accommodate. A Pacific coastal migration using watercraft is the leading alternative hypothesis for early human presence in South America at that date. Genetic studies published between 2015 and 2021 identified ancestry signatures in certain Amazonian populations that don't fit cleanly into a single founding migration event, suggesting a more structurally layered settlement history. Linguistic diversity across indigenous American languages, encompassing dozens of completely unrelated language families with no shared ancestry, is so extensive that some researchers argue it could only have accumulated through multiple separate migrations across tens of thousands of years. The land bridge story was the textbook answer for a century, because it was the simplest explanation available, which is a different thing from being the correct one. 38. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, and the story gets taught as democracy functioning correctly. Teddy Roosevelt. Trust busting. The government standing up for the public against a monopoly too powerful to be permitted. John D. Rockefeller's personal wealth increased substantially in the years following the breakup. When the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil dissolved into 34 constituent companies, Rockefeller owned shares in all of them. The combined stock value of the successor companies rose significantly after the breakup, making him considerably wealthier than he had been when the monopoly was intact. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's dissolution remained among the most powerful corporations in American history. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. The story doesn't end there. ExxonMobil's merger in 1999 reunited 2 of the largest Standard Oil successors, 88 years after the court-mandated separation, reconsolidating a significant portion of what had been forcibly divided. The Sherman Antitrust Act enforcement against Standard Oil took 23 years from passage to conclusion, during which Standard Oil continued operating and Rockefeller continued accumulating. The government broke up the most powerful monopoly in American history, and the man who owned it got richer. You can decide whether that's regulatory failure or an inadvertent lesson in portfolio diversification. 39. Tutankhamun is history's most recognized pharaoh. The golden mask, the ancient grandeur, the name that defines Egyptian civilization in the popular imagination. He was a minor ruler who died at approximately 18 years old after a reign of roughly 9 years, and was so thoroughly erased from official Egyptian records by his successors that he was essentially unknown to historians until Howard Carter found his tomb in 1922. His name was systematically removed from king lists and monuments after his death, which is why grave robbers over 3,000 years of Egyptian history never found him. His obscurity is the reason his burial survived intact. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at approximately 8 or 9 years old, almost certainly as a political instrument of powerful court advisors, including the general Horemheb and the official Eye, who succeeded him as pharaoh after his death. Physical examination of his mummy has revealed multiple conditions consistent with inbreeding, including bone disease and malaria, suggesting he was in poor health throughout a reign he may have had little practical authority over anyway. The most famous pharaoh in the world became famous because ancient Egyptians did such a thorough job of deleting him from the historical record that there was nothing left to attract a thief. His fame is entirely a consequence of his official irrelevance. 40. The Pentagon Papers get referenced periodically, usually as an example of courageous journalism. What they actually contained, and what they reveal about the relationship between government and public knowledge across more than a decade, gets discussed considerably less. The Pentagon Papers, commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, documented that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had systematically deceived Congress and the American public about the Vietnam War's military situation, its unwinnable trajectory, and the factual basis for its escalation. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964, which provided the congressional authorization for full-scale military escalation, was based on a reported North Vietnamese attack on U.S. ships on August 4th that McNamara later acknowledged almost certainly did not occur. Operation Phoenix, the CIA-directed program targeting Viet Cong political infrastructure between 1965 and 1972, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 Vietnamese civilians, according to the program's own records. The Nixon administration's secret bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country, was concealed from Congress through systematically falsified military reporting, a fact that emerged during Watergate investigations. The government spent a decade telling you a war was winnable, while their own classified assessments said the opposite. The deception was not a communications failure. It was the strategy. 41. Ancient Egyptians are famous for worshiping cats as divine beings, a reverence so complete that killing a cat carried the death penalty, and mourners shaved their eyebrows when a household cat died. The practical agricultural foundation of that relationship gets omitted almost entirely from the popular version. Egypt's civilization was built on grain, and grain stores required protection from rodents at a scale that made effective pest control existentially important to the food supply. Cats earned their protected status by performing a function that directly preserved the agricultural surplus on which Egyptian society depended. The goddess Bastet was originally depicted as a lioness representing fierce protective power, and only later became associated with domesticated cats. The transition reflects evolving cultural and agricultural priorities rather than timeless feline worship. Herodotus's accounts of Egyptians rushing into burning buildings to save cats and mourning dead cats by shaving their eyebrows were written by a foreign traveler whose reputation for sensationalism was well established among ancient contemporaries and may reflect exaggerated or regionally specific practices rather than universal Egyptian behavior. Archaeological examination of large cat mummy caches has revealed that many were deliberately killed at young ages to be sold as votive offerings, suggesting a commercial religious industry operating alongside whatever genuine reverence existed. The theology, in other words, appears to have followed the economics. 42. Different cells in your body have wildly different lifespans, and the tidy 7-year complete cellular renewal figure that circulates through popular culture collapses immediately on contact with the actual biology. Red blood cells live approximately 120 days. Intestinal lining cells turn over in 2 to 4 days. Skin cells replace themselves in roughly 2 to 3 weeks. There is no single 7-year cycle governing the whole system. Neurons in the cerebral cortex are largely the same cells you were born with. They persist for your entire lifetime without replacement. The neurons encoding your memories, your earliest experiences, your most persistent anxieties, are the same physical cells that have been in your skull since birth. A 2005 study by Jonas Friesen used carbon-14 dating, made possible by the distinctive atmospheric signature left by Cold War nuclear testing, to measure actual cell ages in the human body. The average age of cells in an adult came out to roughly 7 to 10 years, but that average conceals variation so extreme as to make the average functionally meaningless. Tooth enamel contains no living cells and is never replaced. It is a mineral record of your early development that remains chemically unchanged from childhood unless physically damaged. You are not a different person every 7 years. The neurons holding your most embarrassing memories are original equipment, and they are not going anywhere. 43. Watergate gets summarized as a burglary scandal. Nixon's people broke into a hotel. Nixon covered it up. Nixon resigned. A significant political crime, appropriately punished. The burglary was one incident within a systematic pattern of criminal activity orchestrated from the White House that included illegal wiretapping, obstruction of justice, large-scale campaign finance violations, and the deliberate use of federal government agencies as political weapons against a compiled list of perceived enemies. The Nixon White House maintained an enemies list exceeding 200 names: journalists, politicians, entertainers, who were targeted for IRS audits, FBI surveillance, and other forms of government harassment. The Committee to Re-elect the President ran a coordinated dirty tricks operation that included forged letters planted in opposing campaigns, paid infiltrators inside Democratic campaign organizations, and millions of dollars in illegal contributions. Nixon ordered the CIA to obstruct the FBI's Watergate investigation by falsely invoking national security, an abuse of executive power that extended far beyond concealing a single break-in. The Saturday Night Massacre of October 1973, when Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, and both the Attorney General and his deputy resigned rather than carry out the order, revealed an executive branch prepared to dismantle the Justice Department's independence to protect itself. Watergate wasn't a burglary that escalated. It was a criminal enterprise that happened to include a burglary, and you named the whole thing after the least interesting part. 44. Rome fell because it rotted from within. Moral decay, decadent excess, bread and circuses, lead pipes poisoning the decision-making capacity of an entire civilization. This narrative is useful because it implies a cautionary lesson. It is substantially unsupported by the actual historical mechanisms that ended the Western Roman Empire. The Antonine Plague, which ran from approximately 165 to 180 CE, and the Plague of Cyprian, from 249 to 262 CE, killed millions of Romans across the empire's most productive decades. These consecutive pandemics depleted the military, reduced the agricultural labor force, and created tax revenue shortfalls that permanently weakened the empire's structural capacity in ways that political leadership could not compensate for, regardless of its quality. The 3rd century CE saw 26 emperors in 50 years, most killed by their own soldiers. A political instability rooted in the absence of any reliable succession mechanism, not in cultural decline. Historian Peter Heather and others emphasize the role of the Huns displacing Germanic peoples into Roman territory as the proximate external cause of the Western Empire's 5th century collapse. The lead pipe hypothesis for cognitive impairment has been largely disputed by isotopic analysis of Roman skeletal remains. You blamed orgies and plumbing for a collapse driven by pandemic mortality, fiscal failure, and geopolitical migration pressure, because the accurate version doesn't fit on a warning label. 45. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for 48 years, and the institution gets described as having only recently become politically weaponized. Hoover served as FBI director from 1924 to 1972 under 8 consecutive presidents, from Coolidge through Nixon. Every administration was aware that he maintained compromising files on political figures and used them as instruments of personal and institutional leverage, and every administration kept him in his position anyway. The relationship was mutually beneficial in ways that make rogue director operating independently an inaccurate frame. COINTELPRO, run by Hoover's FBI from 1956 to 1971, conducted illegal surveillance, infiltration operations, and active disruption campaigns against civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and socialist political parties. The program sent Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter that explicitly encouraged him to take his own life. Hoover maintained personal files physically separate from official FBI records. When he died in 1972, his personal secretary, Helen Gandy, destroyed an estimated 17,000 to 20,000 pages of these personal files before they could be reviewed by anyone with oversight authority. Presidents from Roosevelt through Nixon used Hoover's organization as a political intelligence tool against their own domestic opponents. The FBI was not politicized recently. It was founded by a man who kept operational blackmail files on every president he served under, and every president kept him because the arrangement was useful to them. 46. Edward Jenner. 1796. Cowpox. Smallpox. The birth of vaccination. The story is clean, attributable, and begins in the wrong place by roughly 8 centuries. Variolation, deliberate inoculation with material from smallpox lesions to induce controlled immunity, was practiced in China as early as the 10th century CE during the Song dynasty, documented in Chinese medical texts describing the technique of blowing dried smallpox scab material into the nostril. The practice reached the Ottoman Empire and was observed in Constantinople by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the British ambassador, in 1717. She had her own children inoculated and campaigned actively for the technique's adoption in Britain upon returning home. Variolation was being practiced in Britain decades before Jenner conducted his cowpox experiments. Jenner's genuine and significant contribution was identifying that cowpox infection provided immunity to smallpox with substantially lower risk than direct smallpox variolation. He improved the delivery method and reduced the danger, but he did not originate the immunological concept. The word vaccine derives from vacca, the Latin word for cow, coined in reference to Jenner's specific method. Vaccination as a concept existed in China before Europe had developed a germ theory of disease, was imported to Britain by a diplomat's wife, and was then named after the European physician who refined the procedure 40 years after it arrived on the continent. 47, Apollo 13 is remembered as a disaster, an explosion in space, 3 astronauts in mortal danger, a mission that failed. NASA's official classification for Apollo 13 is successful failure, which is a designation that rewards closer examination than the disaster framing typically allows. All 3 crew members, James Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, returned alive after traveling approximately 500,000 miles using the lunar module as an unplanned emergency lifeboat in a scenario that had never been rehearsed, tested, or formally designed for. Flight controllers and engineers on the ground improvised a carbon dioxide scrubber solution using only materials confirmed to be physically aboard the spacecraft. A square peg adapted to fit a round hole using duct tape, cardboard, and plastic bags under life or death time pressure, with no margin for a second attempt. The return trajectory used the moon's gravity to redirect the spacecraft toward Earth. A navigational solution calculated under emergency conditions with limited electrical power available for computing systems. The actual words spoken were, "Houston, we've had a problem," past tense, delivered calmly by Jack Swigert, not the present tense version made famous by the 1995 film. You call it a failure because the crew didn't land on the moon, which is the same logic that would call a surgeon a failure for keeping a patient alive when the operating room caught fire. 48. The Mongol Empire enters popular history as a wave of destruction. Genghis Khan, burning cities, pyramids of skulls, civilization's destroyers advancing across Eurasia and contributing nothing but ash and depopulation. The Mongol Empire created the largest contiguous free trade zone in human history and actively enabled the most significant transfer of technologies, goods, and ideas between East and West that the medieval world would see. The Pax Mongolica of the 13th and 14th centuries established secure trade routes stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Marco Polo's celebrated journey was only logistically possible because Mongol governance made the routes safe enough to travel. Genghis Khan issued a decree of religious tolerance across the empire, exempting religious leaders of all faiths from taxation and military conscription. Mosques, churches, Buddhist temples, And Taoist monasteries operated freely under Mongol administration, regardless of the local population's conquered status. Chinese technologies, including gunpowder, printing methods, and paper currency, spread westward significantly through Mongol-controlled trade networks during this period. Mongol rulers in conquered territories frequently incorporated existing local administrative systems and retained local scholars, rather than dismantling the infrastructure of governance. The civilization history remembers purely as a destroying force, also constructed the world's largest free trade network and maintained a religious tolerance policy that most modern governments still cannot match. But they burned Baghdad, so that is the part you kept. 49, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," and you have been reciting that phrase as the founding statement of American democracy ever since. Jefferson owned over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime, freed only 2 while alive, and the phrase's actual scope, as understood by its author and by the men who signed it, applied to propertied white men. Jefferson privately acknowledged slavery as a moral evil throughout his adult life and took no meaningful action to end it. His personal debts made manumitting his enslaved population financially inconvenient, a calculation he made explicit in private correspondence that has been available to historians for generations. The original draft of the Declaration contained a passage assigning blame to King George for the slave trade. It was removed at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia delegates, which means the contradiction between the document's language and its signatories' practices was recognized in the room and deliberately set aside. Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, contains extended passages arguing for what he considered the intellectual and physical inferiority of black people, written by the same man who had written about self-evident equality 4 years earlier. He wrote the most celebrated sentence about human equality in American history, while enslaving people in the building adjacent to where he was writing, and spent the remainder of his life never locating a convenient moment to reconcile the two facts. 50. The Lusitania sinking in May 1915 gets presented as an unprovoked German atrocity against innocent civilians. A passenger ship, a submarine, 1,198 dead, and an outraged neutral nation eventually pulled into the war. A British government inquiry in 1919 confirmed the Lusitania was carrying approximately 4.2 million 303 rifle cartridges, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, and 18 cases of non-explosive fuses, cargo that classified it as a legitimate military target under the maritime law of the period. Germany had placed advertisements in New York newspapers before the voyage, warning that ships entering the war zone around Britain were subject to attack. Those advertisements appeared in print alongside the Lusitania's scheduled departure announcement, which means passengers boarded informed of the risk. The British Admiralty, which controlled naval routing for ships approaching Britain, diverted the Lusitania's naval escort before the final approach to the Irish coast, and did not warn the ship's captain about confirmed German submarine activity in the area. Whether that was negligence or something more deliberate has never been conclusively resolved. The United States did not enter World War I until 1917, 2 years after the sinking, driven primarily by Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. The ship history remembers as an innocent civilian vessel had a cargo manifest that stayed classified for decades, which is how the clean version of the story survived long enough to become the only one you know. 51. The medieval Catholic Church is the standard villain in popular histories of scientific suppression, burning heretics, silencing astronomers, maintaining 1,000 years of enforced ignorance, while knowledge waited for secular enlightenment to rescue it from institutional theology. The medieval Catholic Church was the primary institutional funder and physical host of scientific inquiry in Europe for several centuries. The university system was a church creation, Bologna in 1088, Oxford around 1096, Paris around 1150. and these institutions housed Europe's most advanced work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy across the period being condemned. Gregor Mendel, whose experiments with pea plants in the 1850s and 1860s established the foundational principles of modern genetics, was an Augustinian friar working in a monastery with institutional resources provided by religious life. The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 was a papal initiative driven explicitly by astronomical precision. Pope Gregory XIII commissioned leading mathematicians and astronomers to correct accumulated drift in the Julian calendar. Galileo's conflict with church authority was substantially political and interpersonal in its specific dynamics. He had significant church allies. His heliocentric theory lacked the observational proof required to formally overturn established cosmology, and he publicly insulted the sitting pope in a published dialogue that made reconciliation difficult. The institution blamed for suppressing science invented the universities where European science was conducted, which is a complication the standard narrative finds inconvenient and therefore omits. 52. Democrats and Republicans, the permanent binary of American political life. Two parties, two choices, the framework that has always existed, and by strong institutional implication, must always remain. The Republican Party did not exist until 1854. Before it, the dominant opposition to the Democrats was the Whig Party, which produced 4 American presidents before collapsing entirely over slavery in the early 1850s and being replaced by an entirely new political coalition within a single decade. Before the Whigs, the primary divide was between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and the Federalist Party dissolved completely by 1820, leaving a brief period of effectively single-party national governance that historians call the era of good feelings. The United States has operated under at least 5 distinct party systems since its founding, with major parties rising, fracturing, and being replaced by new coalitions within living memory of their predecessors. Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party in 1912 actually outpolled the Republican Party in the popular vote. Third parties have cracked the system before, and could again. The current two-party structure is maintained through first-past-the-post voting, state-level ballot access laws of varying restrictiveness, and campaign finance architecture favoring established organizations. None of these are constitutional requirements. The two parties you are told have always existed replaced 2 completely different parties that also, in their own time, presented themselves as permanent. 53. Fleming found the mold, and that is where the popular story of penicillin begins and essentially ends. Alexander Fleming, a contaminated petri dish in 1928, one accidental observation that changed the course of medicine and saved hundreds of millions of lives. Fleming observed that penicillium mold inhibited bacterial growth in his laboratory, but concluded the substance was too chemically unstable and difficult to produce in any therapeutically useful quantity. He largely set the research aside by 1931. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain at Oxford University spent years from 1938 onward doing the painstaking chemical work of purifying penicillin, stabilizing it sufficiently for clinical administration, and conducting the first human clinical trials in 1941. The drug that reached Allied military hospitals by the end of World War II was the product of that decade of unglamorous pharmacological labor, not the afternoon observation that preceded it by 13 years. Mass production of penicillin at therapeutic scale further required a coordinated American industrial and government effort. The medicine was as much a manufacturing achievement as a scientific discovery. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the 1945 Nobel Prize, but public memory assigned the story almost entirely to the man who made the initial observation and then walked away from the problem it presented. 54. The ancient Olympics get described as the original celebration of pure athletic competition. Greek city-states setting aside their conflicts. Athletes competing honestly before the gods. A model of sportsmanship that modern games are designed to recover and honor. the ancient Olympics were politically entangled, routinely corrupt, and structured in ways of explicit exclusion that the idealized version omits without apparent embarrassment. Married women were barred from attending the games under penalty of death. Only the priestess of Demeter received a formal exception by established tradition. The Greek writer Pausanias documented a notable row of bronze statues at Olympia called Zanes, erected using fines collected from athletes caught bribing opponents or judges, enough penalty monuments to form a recognizable walkway at the entrance to the stadium, which suggests bribery was an ongoing institutional problem rather than an occasional aberration. City-states routinely offered substantial financial rewards to victorious athletes. Solon of Athens set the prize for Olympic victory at 500 drachmas, approximately 500 days of wages for a skilled worker, making the games an explicitly commercial enterprise from their most celebrated period. The definition of Greek citizenship, the eligibility requirement, was itself politically manipulated to include or exclude competitors according to convenience. The Olympics you romanticize as pure idealism had corruption monuments, prize money, execution provisions for women who attended, and eligibility rules that bent to politics. That is closer to the modern games than the myth acknowledges. 55. The CIA's MKUltra program occupies a specific compartment in popular memory, a Cold War aberration, a brief period of institutional excess, exposed by congressional investigation, and shut down before the damage became irreparable. MKUltra ran for over 2 decades, involved at least 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and federal prisons, and its records were deliberately destroyed by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973 when he learned a congressional investigation was imminent. What investigators subsequently found was based on a document cache that survived only because it had been stored in a financial records building that escaped the ordered purge. Everything else was gone before anyone with oversight authority could read it. The program administered LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, and other chemical agents to unwitting subjects including prisoners, mental patients, and CIA employees. At least one death, Frank Olson in 1953, resulted from an unsanctioned dosing. Over 150 individual research projects were conducted at institutions including Harvard University, Stanford University, and Massachusetts General Hospital, meaning the country's most prestigious academic medical establishments were active participants. The government ran a covert human experimentation program for 2 decades using your most celebrated universities as research facilities, then destroyed the documentation before you could read it. What you currently know represents only what the shredding missed. 56. Einstein the committed pacifist stands symbolically apart from the weapon that defined the 20th century. A man of pure theory, whose contributions to human understanding existed at a remove from the industrial violence they eventually enabled. This requires ignoring a specific document dated August 2nd, 1939. The letter Einstein co-authored with physicist Leo Szilard and addressed to President Roosevelt explicitly warned that nuclear chain reactions in large masses of uranium could generate destructive power on an unprecedented scale, and urgently recommended that the U.S. government secure uranium supplies and fund nuclear research before Germany did so first. Roosevelt received the letter in October 1939 and established the Advisory Committee on Uranium, the organizational precursor to the Manhattan Project. Einstein was subsequently barred from the Manhattan Project because Army security considered his political associations a disqualifying liability. He learned Hiroshima had been destroyed from a radio broadcast identical to every other civilian in America. After the bombing, Einstein stated publicly that signing the letter was the great mistake of his life, while acknowledging he would have signed it again given what was known about German nuclear ambitions in 1939. His equation provided the theoretical basis for understanding nuclear energy conversion. The pacifist physicist authored the letter that initiated the nuclear arms race, was deemed too politically risky to witness it, and heard the result on the radio. 57. The Bering Land Bridge migration is the settled explanation for how the Americas were populated, People walked from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, spread southward, and eventually filled 2 continents. One route, one founding event, story complete. Multiple independent lines of genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence now indicate the settlement history is considerably more complex than a single corridor and a single founding movement of people. The Monte Verde site in southern Chile has been reliably dated to approximately 14,500 BCE, before the inland Bering Corridor was geographically navigable on foot, which requires an explanation the single land bridge model cannot provide. A Pacific coastal migration using watercraft is the leading alternative hypothesis for early human presence at those southern latitudes at that date. Genetic studies published between 2015 and 2021 identified ancestry signatures in certain Amazonian populations inconsistent with a single founding migration event, suggesting a more layered settlement structure involving multiple source populations. The linguistic diversity across indigenous American languages, spanning dozens of completely unrelated language families with no demonstrable shared ancestry, is so extensive that some researchers argue it could only have accumulated through multiple separate migrations across tens of thousands of years, not a single founding population. The land bridge story was the textbook answer for a century because it was the simplest available, which has historically been a poor standard for scientific accuracy. 58. Standard Oil was broken up by Supreme Court order in 1911, and the story enters the history books as democracy functioning correctly, trust busting, the government standing against monopoly power on behalf of the public, the system working as designed. John D. Rockefeller's personal wealth increased substantially in the years following the court-mandated dissolution. When Standard Oil was divided into 34 constituent companies, Rockefeller owned shares in all of them. The combined market value of the successor companies rose significantly after the breakup, enriching him more than the intact monopoly had. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's dissolution remained among the most consequential corporations in American history. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. ExxonMobil's merger in 1999 reunited 2 of the largest Standard Oil successors 88 years after the court forced them apart, reconsolidating a substantial portion of what judicial intervention had divided. Sherman Antitrust Act enforcement against Standard Oil took 23 years from the law's passage in 1890 to the court's decision in 1911, during which Standard Oil operated with minimal constraint and Rockefeller accumulated further wealth. The government broke up the most powerful monopoly in American history, and the man who owned all of it got richer. Whether that represents regulatory success is a question worth sitting with. 59. Tutankhamun is the most recognized name in ancient Egyptian history. The golden mask, the buried treasure, the face that defines the civilization in popular imagination. He was a minor ruler who died at approximately 18 years old after a reign of roughly 9 years, and was so systematically erased from official Egyptian records by his successors that historians did not know he had existed until Howard Carter found his undisturbed tomb in 1922. His name was removed from king lists, his monuments were dismantled, and his memory was suppressed so effectively that 3,000 years of grave robbers who emptied virtually every other royal tomb in Egypt never found him. His burial survived because his successors ensured no one knew where to look. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at approximately 8 or 9 years old, almost certainly functioning as a political instrument of powerful court figures, including the general Horemheb and the administrator Ai, who succeeded him as pharaoh immediately after his death. Physical examination of his mummy has revealed conditions consistent with inbreeding, including bone disease and malaria, suggesting a young ruler in poor health with limited practical authority. The most famous pharaoh in the world is famous because ancient Egyptians deleted him so thoroughly that tomb robbers couldn't find him. His global recognition is a direct product of his historical insignificance. 60. The Pentagon Papers represent a famous moment of press courage and their specific contents. What they revealed about the relationship between government statements and government knowledge across more than a decade of war received less sustained attention than the drama of their publication. The Pentagon Papers documented that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had systematically deceived Congress and the American public about the Vietnam War, its military trajectory, its prospects for success, and the factual basis for its escalation. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964, the congressional authorization for full military escalation, was based on a reported North Vietnamese attack on American ships on August 4th that McNamara later acknowledged almost certainly did not take place. Operation Phoenix, the CIA-directed program targeting Viet Cong political networks between 1965 and 1972, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 Vietnamese civilians, according to the program's own internal documentation. The Nixon administration's secret bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country, was concealed from Congress through systematically falsified military records, a deception that emerged during the Watergate investigations. The government spent a decade assuring you a war was winnable, while its own classified assessments documented the opposite conclusion. The gap between what was said publicly and what was known privately was not an oversight. It was policy, maintained across 4 administrations by design. 61. Ancient Egyptians worshipped cats as divine beings walking among them, a reverence so total that killing a cat carried a death sentence, and families in mourning shaved their eyebrows when a household cat died. The practical agricultural foundation of that relationship receives almost no attention in the popular version. Egypt was a grain civilization, and the grain stores that sustained it required effective protection from rodents at a scale that made pest control a matter of civilizational survival. Cats performed that function, and the protection extended to them reflected their economic value at least as much as any theological conviction. The goddess Bastet was originally depicted as a lioness, ferocious, protective, and only gradually became associated with domesticated cats as cultural priorities shifted. Herodotus's accounts of Egyptians rushing into fires to rescue cats and expressing elaborate grief at a cat's death were composed by a foreign traveler whose reputation for embellishment was noted by ancient contemporaries and likely reflect regional practices or deliberate exaggeration rather than universal Egyptian behavior. Large-scale examination of cat mummy caches has revealed that many animals were killed deliberately at young ages to be sold as votive offerings to temple visitors, suggesting a commercial religious industry operating in parallel with whatever genuine reverence existed. The theology appears to have developed in close alignment with the economics, not independently of it. 62. Different cells in your body have completely different lifespans, and the 7-year complete cellular renewal figure that circulates through wellness culture and casual conversation collapses immediately on contact with basic cell biology. Red blood cells live approximately 120 days. Intestinal lining cells turn over in 2 to 4 days. Skin cells replace in roughly 2 to 3 weeks. There is no single 7-year biological clock governing the whole system. Neurons in the cerebral cortex are largely the same cells present at birth. They persist across your entire lifetime without replacement. The neurons encoding your earliest memories, your deepest habits, your most durable anxieties, are the same physical cells that have occupied your skull since you were an infant. A 2005 study by Jonas Frisén used carbon-14 dating, made possible by the distinctive atmospheric isotope signature left by Cold War nuclear weapons testing, to measure actual cell ages in living tissue. The average age of cells in an adult human came out to roughly 7 to 10 years, but that figure conceals variation so extreme that the average is almost meaningless as a description of any individual tissue. Tooth enamel contains no living cells and is never replaced. It is a permanent mineral record of your early development. You are not entirely new every 7 years. Your most persistent memories are running on original hardware, and that hardware has no scheduled replacement cycle. 63. Watergate gets condensed in cultural memory to a burglary and a cover-up. Nixon's people broke into a hotel. Nixon lied about it. Nixon resigned. A significant criminal episode, punished through constitutional process. The burglary was one component of a systematic criminal operation run from the White House that included illegal wiretapping programs, obstruction of justice on multiple fronts, large-scale campaign finance crimes, and the coordinated use of federal government agencies as weapons against a formally maintained list of political opponents. The Nixon White House enemies list exceeded 200 names and targeted journalists, elected officials, and public figures for IRS audits, FBI surveillance, and other government harassment. The committee to re-elect the president ran dirty tricks operations, including forged correspondence planted in opposing campaigns, paid infiltrators embedded in Democratic campaign organizations, and millions of dollars in illegal contributions laundered through multiple accounts. Nixon personally ordered the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in by falsely invoking national security concerns, an instruction that went significantly beyond concealing a single criminal incident. The Saturday Night Massacre of October 1973, when Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox and both the Attorney General and his deputy resigned in protest rather than comply with the order, revealed an executive branch prepared to dismantle prosecutorial independence to protect itself. You named a systematic criminal enterprise after its least consequential component. 64. Rome fell because it rotted from within. Decadence, excess, moral failure, lead contaminating the water supply and the decision-making capacity of the people running the empire. This narrative persists because it carries a useful cautionary structure. It is poorly supported by the historical mechanisms that actually ended the Western Roman Empire across the 5th century CE. The Antonine Plague, running from approximately 165 to 180 CE, and the Plague of Cyprian, from 249 to 262 CE, killed millions of Romans during the empire's most demographically and economically productive generations. These consecutive pandemic events depleted military manpower, reduced agricultural labor, and created fiscal shortfalls that permanently damaged the empire's structural capacity in ways that no subsequent political leadership could fully compensate for. The 3rd century CE saw 26 emperors in 50 years, most killed by their own soldiers, political instability generated by the absence of any reliable succession mechanism, not by cultural moral decline. Historian Peter Heather and others have emphasized the role of the Huns displacing Germanic peoples into Roman territory as the proximate external catalyst of the Western Empire's final collapse in the 5th century. The lead poisoning hypothesis has been largely contested by isotopic analysis of Roman skeletal remains, showing blood lead concentrations insufficient to account for civilization-wide impairment. You blamed orgies and plumbing for a collapse driven by compounding pandemic mortality, fiscal structural failure, and large-scale geopolitical migration, because the accurate version doesn't compress into a moral lesson. 65. The FBI is described as a professional, apolitical law enforcement institution that has only recently become entangled in political controversy through external pressure. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI from 1924 to 1972, 48 years, under 8 consecutive presidents, from Coolidge to Nixon. Every administration in that span was aware that he maintained compromising files on political figures and used them as instruments of institutional self-preservation. Every administration kept him anyway, because the arrangement provided them with intelligence on their own enemies. COINTELPRO operated by Hoover's FBI from 1956 to 1971, conducted illegal surveillance operations, infiltration of political organizations, and active disruption campaigns against civil rights groups, anti-war organizations, and socialist political parties. The program sent Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter that explicitly suggested he should kill himself. Hoover maintained personal files physically separate from official FBI records. When he died in 1972, his secretary, Helen Gandy, destroyed an estimated 17,000 to 20,000 pages from those files before any oversight authority could examine them. Presidents from Roosevelt through Nixon used Hoover's organization as a political intelligence instrument against domestic opponents. The institution was not politicized recently by external interference. It was built by a man who kept blackmail files on every president he served, and every president kept him in office because the arrangement served their own political purposes simultaneously. 66. Edward Jenner, 1796. A Milkmaid's Observation. Cowpox as Protection Against Smallpox. The origin story of vaccination, contained and attributed, One Man in One Moment. Deliberate inoculation with material from active smallpox lesions to induce controlled immunity was practiced in China as early as the 10th century CE during the Song dynasty, documented in medical texts describing the technique of introducing dried smallpox scab material into the nostril. The practice reached the Ottoman Empire and was directly observed in Constantinople by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman court in 1717. She arranged for her own children to be inoculated and conducted an active campaign for the technique's adoption in Britain upon returning home. Variolation was being practiced in Britain decades before Jenner's cowpox experiments. Jenner's genuine contribution was identifying cowpox as a safer substitute for smallpox material in inducing immunity. He reduced the risk significantly, but the immunological concept he applied had been practiced across multiple cultures for centuries before he formalized it in English. The word vaccine derives from vacca, the Latin word for cow, coined in reference to Jenner's specific method. The concept existed in China before Europe had formulated a germ theory of disease, arrived in Britain through a diplomat's wife, and was subsequently named after the European physician who improved the delivery mechanism 4 decades after it reached the continent. 67. Apollo 13 is remembered primarily as a space disaster, an explosion, 3 astronauts in acute danger, a mission that failed to accomplish its objective. NASA's formal classification of Apollo 13 is successful failure, a designation that repays more attention than the disaster framing typically generates. All 3 crew members returned alive after traveling approximately 500,000 miles, using the lunar module as an unplanned emergency lifeboat in a scenario that had never been rehearsed, designed for, or incorporated into any official contingency planning. Engineers and flight controllers on the ground improvised a carbon dioxide scrubber solution using only materials confirmed to be physically present aboard the spacecraft, adapting a square component to fit a round housing using duct tape, cardboard, and plastic bags, under life or death time pressure with no second attempt available. The return trajectory was calculated to use lunar gravity to redirect the crippled spacecraft toward Earth, a navigational solution derived under emergency conditions with severely limited electrical power available for onboard computing systems. The actual words spoken during the emergency were, "Houston, we've had a problem." Past tense, delivered with considerable calm by Jack Swigert. Not the present tense version made famous by the 1995 theatrical film. You call it a failure because the crew didn't land on the moon. That is the same reasoning that would classify a surgeon as a failure for keeping a patient alive after the operating room caught fire mid-procedure. 68. The Mongol Empire arrives in popular history as a force of pure destruction. Genghis Khan, burning cities, depopulated regions, the civilization-ending wave that set back human progress wherever it reached. The Mongol Empire simultaneously created the largest contiguous free trade zone in recorded human history and enabled the most significant sustained transfer of technologies, commodities, and ideas between East and West that the medieval world experienced. The Pax Mongolica of the 13th and 14th centuries established functionally secure trade routes extending from China to Eastern Europe. The journey Marco Polo described was only logistically feasible because Mongol political administration had made those routes safe enough for a merchant to travel without being robbed or killed at every border. Genghis Khan issued a formal decree of religious tolerance across the empire, exempting religious leaders of all recognized faiths from taxation and military service obligations. Mosques, churches, Buddhist temples, and Taoist monasteries operated freely under Mongol governance regardless of the conquered status of local populations. Chinese technologies, including gunpowder, printing methods, and paper currency, spread westward substantially through Mongol-controlled trade networks during this period. Mongol rulers in conquered territories regularly incorporated existing local administrative systems and retained local scholars, rather than replacing governance infrastructure entirely. The civilization history records purely as a destroying force also built the world's largest free trade network and maintained a religious tolerance policy that many contemporary governments still fall short of. The burning of Baghdad is the part you kept. 69, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," and you have been reciting that phrase as the cornerstone of American democratic ideals ever since it was first read aloud. Jefferson owned over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime, freed only 2 while alive, and the phrase's operative scope, as understood by its author and by the men who signed their names beneath it, applied to propertied white men. Jefferson acknowledged slavery as a moral evil in private correspondence throughout his adult life, and took no meaningful action to end it. His personal debts made manumitting his enslaved population financially inconvenient, a calculation he committed to paper in letters that historians have had access to for generations. The original draft of the Declaration contained a passage attributing blame to King George for the slave trade. It was removed at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia delegates, demonstrating that the contradiction between the document's language and its signatories' practices was recognized in the room and deliberately avoided. Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, contains extended passages arguing for what he considered the intellectual and physical inferiority of black people. Written by the same man who had composed the self-evident equality passage 9 years earlier. He wrote the most celebrated sentence about human equality in American history while enslaving people in the adjacent building, and spent the remaining decades of his life finding no convenient moment to address that particular inconsistency. 70. The Lusitania enters history as an unprovoked German atrocity against innocent civilians. A passenger liner, a submarine, 1,198 dead, a neutral nation's outrage eventually pulling it into the war. A British government inquiry conducted in 1919 confirmed that the Lusitania was carrying approximately 4.2 million .303 rifle cartridges, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, and 18 cases of non-explosive fuses at the time of its sinking. Cargo that classified the vessel as a legitimate military target under the maritime law governing the period. Germany had placed formal warning advertisements in New York newspapers before the voyage, notifying travelers that ships entering the war zone around the British Isles were subject to attack. Those notices appeared in print alongside the Lusitania's own departure announcement, which means the passengers who boarded did so with published warning of the risk available to them. The British Admiralty, which controlled naval routing for vessels approaching Britain, redirected the Lusitania's naval escort before the final approach to the Irish coast, and did not alert the ship's captain to confirmed German submarine activity in the area. Whether that represented negligence or something more calculated has never been conclusively established. The United States did not enter World War I until 1917, 2 full years after the sinking, driven primarily by Germany's resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. The cargo manifest stayed classified for decades, which is precisely how the clean version of this story survived long enough to become the only one most people know. 71, Marco Polo spent 17 years in China according to his account, and produced the foundational Western description of Chinese civilization. Eyewitness testimony from a man who walked the Silk Road, served Kublai Khan, and returned to Venice with knowledge that changed European understanding of the East. Historians have noted that Marco Polo's account makes no mention of tea, the dominant daily beverage of Chinese culture consumed at every social level. It does not mention chopsticks, foot binding, the Chinese writing system, printing technology, or the Great Wall, features so ubiquitous in 13th century China that their omission from a 17-year residence memoir requires explanation. Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi had described Chinese civilization in detail before Polo's birth. The geographical descriptions in Polo's account align more closely with Persian merchant sources than with Chinese geographical traditions, leading historian Frances Wood to argue in her 1995 book that Polo may have based his account on information gathered from Persian traders encountered in the Middle East, rather than personal travel to China itself. Polo dictated his account while imprisoned in Genoa to a professional romance writer named Rustichello da Pisa, known for embellishing adventure narratives. The collaboration raises a straightforward question about where observed experience ended and literary invention began, that the book's status as foundational historical source has discouraged people from asking directly. 72, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States, and Reconstruction attempted to address its legacy. The arc of history bending toward justice following 4 years of catastrophic war. The 13th Amendment reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." The exception clause was not an oversight or an editorial accident. Within years of ratification, Southern states enacted black codes criminalizing vagrancy, unemployment, and minor infractions, then leased convicted black men to plantations, mines, and railroad construction operations under conditions materially indistinguishable from the slavery the amendment had nominally ended. Historian Douglas Blackman's Pulitzer Prize-winning research, published in 2008 under the title Slavery by Another Name, documented the scale of convict leasing operations using company and government records that had been publicly available for decades without generating the attention their contents warranted. The system operated across the South from approximately 1865 to the 1940s. In some work camps, annual death rates exceeded 40%, a figure that exceeded mortality rates in many antebellum operations, because lessees had no long-term financial investment in workers' survival. The amendment celebrated as the abolition of slavery contained a clause permitting slavery, and the people who drafted it began exploiting that clause almost immediately. The asterisk is the size of a continent. 73, the Rosetta Stone was discovered by French soldiers in 1799, and you are broadly aware that it unlocked the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphics. 3 scripts, 1 document, ancient knowledge suddenly accessible. The stone sat without successful decipherment for 23 years after its discovery, and the decipherment that eventually occurred was accompanied by a priority dispute that robbed a British scholar of substantial historical credit. Thomas Young, a British polymath, made critical analytical advances in understanding the stone's demotic script and correctly identified that hieroglyphic cartouches represented royal names, work he published in 1819 that provided foundational building blocks for the complete decipherment. Jean-François Champollion, who receives official credit for deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822, had access to Young's published work. The two men engaged in a bitter public dispute over priority that Champollion won primarily by publishing a more comprehensive system first, and outliving Young by 23 years. The Rosetta Stone was seized from French forces by the British following military defeat at the Battle of the Nile and has been held in the British Museum since 1802. Egypt has formally and repeatedly requested its return. The stone is also not unique. It is one of several similar priestly decrees issued under Ptolemy V, selected for significance primarily because it was the most complete trilingual example available to European scholars at the time of discovery. 74. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla were rivals in a technical dispute about electrical current systems. Two great inventors on opposing sides of a legitimate engineering question. Edison waged a deliberate, organized public disinformation campaign against alternating current that included the staged public electrocution of animals, conducted with the explicit purpose of associating AC current with lethal danger in the public mind, while concealing that direct current at equivalent voltages was equally deadly. Edison hired Harold P. Brown, who used Edison's own laboratory facilities to conduct public demonstrations electrocuting dogs and calves, with AC current framing the events as evidence of AC's unique danger. Edison lobbied actively for alternating current to be adopted as the method of execution in New York's newly developed electric chair, a calculated move designed to ensure that if AC became associated with state executions, it would become commercially impossible to market as a domestic power supply. The 1903 electrocution of Topsy the elephant at Coney Island occurred in the aftermath of the disinformation campaign Edison had orchestrated, though it is sometimes inaccurately described as Edison's own direct action. Despite the campaign's considerable scope and public visibility, AC current prevailed on engineering merit. It could be transmitted efficiently over long distances, while DC required a generating station approximately every mile, making any large-scale power grid economically impossible. You cannot electrocute enough animals to override the physics of long-distance power transmission. 75. The Nuremberg trials established that the architects of the Holocaust would face international justice, a new legal framework holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of state authority. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists and engineers into the United States in the years following the war, including individuals directly implicated in war crimes, shielding them from prosecution in exchange for their technical expertise. Wernher von Braun, who directed NASA's Saturn V rocket program and whose work made the Apollo moon landings possible, had been a Schutzstaffel officer who personally selected concentration camp prisoners to serve as forced labor at the underground Mittelwerk factory. Approximately 20,000 people died at Mittelwerk building the V-2 rockets von Braun had designed. Operation Paperclip was deliberately concealed from the State Department, and the public, President Truman's directive, explicitly prohibited recruiting active supporters of National Socialism, so the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency falsified and sanitized the scientists' records before submitting them for immigration processing. Walter Schreiber, a Nazi physician who had conducted biological weapons experiments on concentration camp prisoners, was brought to the United States and given a position at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine, before his background became publicly known in 1952. The Soviet Union ran a parallel program relocating approximately 2,000 German scientists to the USSR. Both superpowers made the same calculation. Technical expertise outweighed legal accountability, and Nuremberg's reach stopped where strategic utility began. 76. The appendix is the standard example of evolutionary redundancy, a vestigial remnant of ancestral digestive anatomy that now serves no function except to occasionally become infected and require surgical removal. Research published in the 21st century indicates the appendix functions as a reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria, maintaining microbial populations capable of repopulating the intestinal microbiome after illness has flushed the system, a function that would have been significantly more important in environments where gastrointestinal disease was a routine threat to survival. A 2007 study by Duke University researchers William Parker and R. Randall Bollinger proposed exactly this safe house hypothesis, arguing the appendix preserves bacterial colonies that can recolonize the gut following severe diarrheal illness. The appendix contains substantial concentrations of lymphoid tissue, a component of the immune system, particularly during childhood and adolescence, suggesting active immunological involvement during precisely the developmental window when immune education matters most. A 2016 study found that individuals who had undergone appendectomy showed slightly elevated risk of Clostridium difficile infection, consistent with the safe house model's prediction that removal would impair microbiome recovery after disruption. A 2013 study determined that the appendix has evolved independently in multiple mammal lineages at least 32 separate times, a pattern that argues strongly against a structure being a functionless leftover, since evolution rarely preserves what costs energy and contributes nothing. The organ you were told was useless has been quietly backing up your gut bacteria for your entire life. 77. The Founding Fathers are presented collectively as a unified council of visionary statesmen who agreed on the principles that would define the American Republic and debated implementation from a shared foundation of compatible values. Alexander Hamilton considered Thomas Jefferson a dangerous radical who would deliver the Republic to mob rule. Jefferson considered Hamilton a crypto-monarchist, engineering a return to the British system they had just fought to escape. Their conflict was personal, sustained, and sufficiently consequential that it generated the American two-party system as a byproduct. Patrick Henry refused to attend the Constitutional Convention entirely, stating he smelt a rat in Philadelphia, and became a leading voice for refusing to ratify the Constitution the convention produced. The Constitutional Convention's proceedings were conducted under conditions of complete secrecy. Windows were nailed shut in Philadelphia summer heat to prevent information from escaping, because the delegates understood that public knowledge of their disagreements would destroy any chance of the document surviving the ratification process. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804. Two of the most prominent architects of the Republic resolved their disagreement with a pistol at 10 paces in a New Jersey field, which is a detail that complicates the mythology of unified founding wisdom considerably more than any textbook has been willing to acknowledge. The men you were taught to treat as a harmonious council of demigods could not be left unsupervised in the same room. 78. The First Persian Gulf War in 1991 gets taught as a clear-cut international response to Iraqi aggression. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The international community organized, and righteous military force restored a small nation's sovereignty. U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie met with Saddam Hussein on July 25, 1990, 8 days before the invasion, and her remarks, as recorded in an Iraqi government transcript subsequently released, included stating that the United States had no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Hussein interpreted this as American non-objection to military action, and the State Department has never fully clarified what Glaspie's instructions were before that meeting. Kuwait had been accused by Iraq of extracting oil from the Rumaila field straddling their shared border, and of exceeding OPEC production quotas in ways that suppressed global oil prices and devastated Iraq's post-war economy. The primary testimony used to build American public support for military intervention, delivered by a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl identified only as Nayira, who described Iraqi soldiers removing premature infants from hospital incubators, was fabricated. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and her testimony had been organized by the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. President George H.W. Bush's administration chose explicitly not to advance on Baghdad and remove Hussein because advisors understood the regional power vacuum that would result. The next Bush administration's team was present for that calculation and chose differently 12 years later. 79. Che Guevara's image circulates globally on merchandise as a symbol of anti-establishment rebellion. The beret, the expression, the shorthand for resistance against entrenched power. Guevara supervised mass executions of political prisoners at La Cabaña prison in Havana following the Cuban Revolution's success in 1959. Estimates of the number of people executed under his command at La Cabaña range from 180 to over 500, including individuals who had fought alongside the revolution, but were subsequently deemed insufficiently loyal to its direction. Guevara's diary from his early motorcycle journey through Latin America contains passages expressing contempt for black populations in Venezuela and discomfort with racial mixing, writings that complicate his image as a universal liberationist in ways his merchandise seldom acknowledges. As Cuba's Minister of Industry from 1961 to 1965, Guevara's attempt to rapidly industrialize the Cuban economy along Maoist lines produced severe consumer shortages and measurable economic contraction. His guerrilla campaigns in the Congo in 1965 and Bolivia in 1966 and 67 were both operational failures. He misjudged local political conditions in both countries, failed to generate the peasant support his theory required, and was captured in Bolivia partly because CIA tracking operations had located him with assistance from local informants. The most commercially successful anti-capitalist symbol in history is a man whose face generates billions in retail revenue annually. He would have found the merchandise objectionable. The executions deserve more of your attention than the poster. 80. Athens is the cradle of democracy. The original model. The founding example. The civilization whose political innovation the modern world aspires to honor and extend. Athenian democracy applied to approximately 10 to 20% of the population at its most functional. Women were excluded entirely. Enslaved people, who constituted approximately 30 to 40% of Athens' total population, had no political standing. Foreign residents, medics, regardless of how long they had lived in the city or how much they contributed to its economy, were permanently excluded from participation. The eligible citizen body numbered roughly 30,000 to 45,000 people out of a total Athenian population of approximately 250,000 to 300,000. Athenian democracy also included ostracism, a procedure by which citizens could vote to exile any individual from the city for 10 years without charges, without trial, and without any formal accusation of wrongdoing. Aristides, known specifically as Aristides the Just, was ostracized by voters who reported being tired of hearing him called just. The Athenian assembly used direct democratic procedure to convict and execute Socrates in 399 BCE, which Plato subsequently used as the foundational argument against democracy as a system of governance. The democracy you cite as your model excluded most of its population, could banish citizens by popularity contest, and voted to execute its most famous philosopher. It is an ancestor of your system the way a great-great-grandparent is yours, technically accurate and not particularly useful as a set of operating instructions. 81. The phrase, "war to end all wars," carries the weight of tragedy in retrospect. The optimism of 1914's August colliding with 4 years of industrial slaughter, and then the bitter irony of what followed 20 years later. The Treaty of Versailles, which formally concluded the war in 1919, was assessed by multiple contemporary observers at the time of its signing as structurally likely to produce another large war within a generation. Economist John Maynard Keynes resigned from the British delegation at Versailles in protest and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, predicting with considerable accuracy that the reparations demands and economic terms imposed on Germany would destabilize European economies and generate the political conditions for extremist movements. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, assigned full moral and legal responsibility for the war to Germany, a claim historians across the political spectrum have found difficult to support, and which German politicians across the entire political spectrum used to delegitimize the Weimar Republic from its first days. The reparations figure eventually set at 132 billion gold marks was economically unsustainable for a devastated country. Germany defaulted. France occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923, and the resulting hyperinflation obliterated the savings of the German middle class. The phrase "war to end all wars" was coined by H.G. Wells in August 1914, before the war concluded, as rhetorical aspiration. Multiple economists predicted the outcome of the peace settlement before the ink dried. They were off by exactly 1 year. 82, the far side of the moon, is called the dark side in common usage, and the implication that it exists in permanent shadow, never touched by sunlight, a realm of perpetual cosmic darkness, has attached itself to the phrase so thoroughly that correcting it feels like arguing with a Pink Floyd album. The far side of the moon receives exactly as much total sunlight as the near side. The moon is tidally locked to Earth, meaning the same face perpetually points toward this planet, but the far side still completes full day and night cycles as the moon orbits the sun. It is not in permanent darkness. It is simply the side you cannot observe from Earth's surface. The term dark side, in original astronomical usage, referred to whichever hemisphere was facing away from the sun at any given moment. A designation that alternates and applies to both sides equally across a lunar cycle, not a permanent description of one face. China's Chang'e 4 mission landed on the lunar far side in January 2019 and photographed a surface illuminated by ordinary sunlight. The far side is unknown, not unlit. Those are different things that have been treated as identical for so long that the correction now sounds wrong, to people who have heard the phrase their entire lives. Pink Floyd's 1973 album is likely more responsible for the conflation than any scientific miscommunication, which is a strange legacy for a record about the human condition. 83. The Trail of Tears is described as a tragic chapter, a misguided policy, an exception to American values, a dark episode in an otherwise principled national story. The Indian Removal Act of 1930 was a deliberate, systematically implemented government policy that displaced approximately 60,000 to 100,000 indigenous people from their ancestral territories and killed an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 of them in the process. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity and that Georgia's laws had no legal force on Cherokee land. President Andrew Jackson proceeded with removal anyway. The Cherokee removal of 1838 and 1839 killed approximately 4,000 of the 16,000 Cherokee people forcibly marched to Indian Territory, roughly 1 in 4, from exposure, disease, and starvation during the journey. The Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw nations suffered proportionally similar losses. Removal was motivated explicitly by land acquisition for white settlers, and across the Deep South, by the demand for territory to expand cotton plantation agriculture. The Creek and Cherokee lands in Georgia and Alabama were among the most agriculturally productive in the region. The policy achieved its stated objectives. Calling it a mistake implies the designers did not intend what occurred. They did. It worked as intended. And the Supreme Court's contrary ruling was simply ignored by the executive branch with no consequence whatsoever. 84. Medicine gets described as a science-based discipline following established evidence and professional best practices, the implication being that your doctor's recommendations are grounded in controlled research rather than tradition, financial incentive, or institutional inertia. Evidence-based medicine as a formal conceptual framework was articulated in 1992, which means that every medical practice preceding that date operated without a systematic methodology for evaluating whether treatments actually worked better than alternatives or nothing at all. Routine tonsillectomy was performed on millions of children throughout the 20th century with minimal rigorous evidence of benefit for the majority of patients, and continued as standard practice long after studies began raising questions, sustained partly by surgical tradition and the fee structures of procedure-based medical practice. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women across Europe and the United Kingdom from 1957 to 1961 as a treatment for morning sickness and caused severe limb malformations in over 10,000 newborns. In the complete absence of any systematic safety testing for effects on fetal development, which was not standard practice at the time, hormone replacement therapy was prescribed to millions of postmenopausal women based partly on observational data, suggesting cardiovascular benefits until the Women's Health Initiative trial, stopped early in 2002, found increased risks of breast cancer and cardiovascular events. The randomized controlled trial became the methodological gold standard only after Austin Bradford Hill formalized the framework in the 1940s and 50s. Everything before that was tradition, observation, and professional confidence, and some of it was bloodletting. 85. The Iran hostage crisis ended on Ronald Reagan's inauguration day in 1981, and the timing has been attributed to Iranian fear of the incoming administration's toughness. The mullahs blinked before a harder president had even been sworn in. The 52 American hostages were released at 12:33 in the afternoon on January 20th, 1981, minutes after Reagan completed the oath of office. John Ehrlichman's confession about the war on drugs established a template for reading government chronology. Multiple individuals with direct access to the relevant events provided statements or testimony consistent with the Reagan campaign having conducted secret negotiations with Iran to delay the hostages' release past the 1980 election, denying President Carter a pre-election diplomatic resolution that might have changed the election's outcome. Former Iranian President Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, former Reagan campaign aide Barbara Honegger, and others made public statements describing back-channel contact. The Iran-Contra affair, which emerged in 1986, revealed that the Reagan administration had been conducting secret arms transactions with Iran, establishing that covert communication between the Reagan orbit and the Iranian government was an operational reality, not an impossibility. 2 congressional investigations in 1991 and 1993 found insufficient documentary evidence to prove the allegation, while noting significant gaps in available records and unresolved questions of fact. The hostages were released to the minute of the inauguration. The same administration was later caught secretly selling weapons to Iran, and the connection between those facts is formally classified as unproven, which is a very specific category of thing that governments are good at producing. 86. Ancient humans were primitive brutes who grunted, clubbed things, and waited around for civilization to be invented. The caveman as a placeholder species between animal and actual human being. Archaeological evidence consistently pushes the dates of complex human behavior further back into prehistory, and what keeps emerging is that people who looked essentially identical to you were doing sophisticated things tens of thousands of years before the timeline you were given allows for. The Blombos cave site in South Africa has yielded ochre-engraved geometric designs dated to between 75,000 and 100,000 BCE, alongside perforated shell beads of similar age. Evidence of symbolic thinking and deliberate personal adornment at a date that predates the conventional narrative of behavioral modernity by a significant margin. The Pinnacle Point Caves in South Africa show evidence of shellfish harvesting, pigment processing, and heat-treated tool production as early as 164,000 BCE. Evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian and marine shells has been recovered from East African sites dated to over 100,000 years ago, indicating social networks spanning hundreds of miles among people classified as pre-modern by the timelines that were written before these sites were excavated. Neanderthals buried their dead, used pigments, and made jewelry. Genetic analysis confirmed they interbred with modern humans. Your ancestors were sophisticated people, working with available materials. They were not waiting for you to show up and consider them primitive. 87. The sugar industry's role in shaping nutritional science is one of the more thoroughly documented cases of commercial interests purchasing academic conclusions and watching those conclusions become national policy. Internal documents revealed through research published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016 showed that the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard scientists approximately $50,000 in current value in 1967 to publish a literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine that minimized sugar's association with heart disease and redirected attention towards saturated fat as the primary dietary culprit. The lead Harvard researcher on that review, D. Mark Hegsted, subsequently became the head of nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture and helped draft the 1977 dietary guidelines that shaped a generation of nutritional advice. Guidelines that aligned, with notable consistency, with the conclusions the industry had paid him to reach nearly a decade earlier. A 2013 systematic review found that industry-funded nutrition studies were significantly more likely to reach conclusions favorable to the sponsoring industry's products than independently funded research on identical questions. The low-fat dietary guidelines that emerged from this period led food manufacturers to replace fat in processed foods with sugar, the precise substitution that researchers now identify as a significant driver of metabolic disease. The industry paid for the science. The scientist wrote the policy, and you ate the result for 30 years. 88. The Berlin Wall fell because Ronald Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and told Mikhail Gorbachev to tear it down. One speech, one moment of moral clarity from American leadership, and the Iron Curtain eventually collapsed under the weight of its own exposure to that rhetoric. The Berlin Wall opened on November 9, 1989, because an East German government spokesman named Günter Schabowski announced new travel regulations at a press conference, and, when asked when they would take effect, checked his notes and said, immediately, without delay, not realizing the announcement was intended to be carefully staged and managed. Crowds gathered at checkpoints within hours and overwhelmed guards who had received no updated orders. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, and his explicit decision not to deploy Soviet military force to preserve Eastern European communist governments, a posture his advisors called the Sinatra Doctrine, were the structural political conditions that made the wall's opening possible. Reagan's 1987 speech was considered a political liability by several of his own senior advisors, who argued in internal memos against the tear down this wall language as needlessly provocative. The wall stood for 2 more years after the speech and came down under Reagan's successor, triggered by a miscommunicated press release at an East Berlin news conference. You turned a bureaucratic accident into a great man of history story, because the alternative requires explaining East German administrative procedure. 89 modern humans emerged from a specific location in Africa, a founding population in a definable cradle of humanity that spread outward to fill the planet. Recent genetic and archaeological evidence indicates the actual picture involves multiple African populations distributed across a continent, exchanging genes intermittently across hundreds of thousands of years, rather than a single founding group in a single founding location. A 2022 study published in Nature used genomic analysis of over 290 populations to model human origins, and concluded that modern humans emerged from at least 2 ancestral African populations that were geographically separated and reconnected multiple times over an extended period, rather than from one continuous population in one place. The out-of-Africa model itself has been significantly refined since its initial formulation. Modern humans outside Africa carry genetic material from Neanderthals and Denisovans, confirming that the history of human populations involves interbreeding with archaic lineages rather than simple replacement of one group by another. Early modern human fossils have been found across a broad geographic range within Africa, from Morocco at approximately 300,000 BCE to Ethiopia at approximately 195,000 BCE, suggesting continent-wide emergence rather than a localized origin event. Mitochondrial Eve, frequently misunderstood as the first human woman, was one individual among many living contemporaries whose matrilineal lineages happened to die out over subsequent generations. You did not come from a garden. You came from an entire continent's worth of populations who kept finding each other. 90. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in 1879 at his Menlo Park laboratory, and American ingenuity illuminated the world. At least 22 inventors produced functional incandescent light bulbs before Edison filed his patent, and the man whose British lawsuit against Edison succeeded was already demonstrating a working carbon filament bulb a full year before Edison's celebrated moment. Humphrey Davy demonstrated arc lighting using a battery in 1802. Warren de la Rue produced a working platinum filament incandescent bulb in 1840. Joseph Swan demonstrated a functional carbon filament bulb in England in 1878, a year before Edison's patent application, and subsequently sued Edison for patent infringement in British courts. Swan won. The two eventually merged their British operations into a company called Ediswan, which is one of the more honest accidental acknowledgments of disputed priority in the history of branding. Edison's genuine and substantial contribution was not the bulb, but the complete system. The generator, transmission infrastructure, metering apparatus, and distribution network needed to deliver electrical power commercially at urban scale, which he demonstrated at Manhattan's Pearl Street Station in 1882. Edison held over 1,000 patents and built the first industrial research laboratory, an institutional model for organized technological development that was arguably his most consequential invention. He did not invent the light bulb. He invented the commercially viable light bulb, plus the reason it mattered, which is more impressive but requires 2 sentences to explain. 91. The Crusades were unprovoked European Christian aggression against Muslim populations. An early installment of Western imperialism dressed in religious justification, attacking civilizations that had done nothing to precipitate the assault. The First Crusade was called in direct response to a formal diplomatic request. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent an embassy to Pope Urban II in 1095, requesting military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, who had conquered Anatolia, modern Turkey, previously the Byzantine heartland, following the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The territories the First Crusade targeted, Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia, had been Christian-majority regions for centuries before the 7th century Islamic conquests. The Crusaders understood themselves as recovering territories rather than invading foreign lands, though the distinction did not moderate the brutality of their methods or protect the civilian populations they encountered. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, in which Crusaders attacked the Christian Byzantine Empire they had originally been summoned to defend, was condemned by Pope Innocent III himself, and remains one of the most consequential acts of the entire crusading period, permanently fracturing relations between Western and Eastern Christianity. Frederick II negotiated control of Jerusalem diplomatically in 1229 without military engagement. The Crusades were called because Christians asked for military help against people who had conquered Christian land, and then became something considerably worse than anyone originally requested, a pattern in military history that has not become less common with time. 92. Political polarization is a new phenomenon produced by social media algorithms and the architecture of online information environments, a problem that did not exist before Facebook and Twitter created echo chambers and radicalized people through engagement-maximizing content recommendation systems. American political polarization has measurable precedents in the 1790s, the 1850s, and the 1960s and 70s that equal or exceed current metrics by most available measures, and the causal relationship between social media and contemporary polarization is actively contested in peer-reviewed research. The 1790s American press was openly partisan. routinely fabricated stories about political opponents, and had editors prosecuted under the Alien and Sedition Acts for political speech that displeased the administration. Polarization metrics measured through congressional voting patterns and social trust surveys began rising in the 1970s and 80s. Well before the commercial internet existed, correlating more strongly with geographic sorting, growing income inequality, and the decline of cross-cutting institutional affiliations like labor unions and civic organizations. A 2023 study published in Nature found that deactivating Facebook for 7 weeks before the 2020 election had minimal measurable effect on political polarization or factual knowledge among participants. Research has also found that most people's social media feeds are actually more ideologically diverse than their offline social networks. You blamed social media for a problem that preceded the internet, accelerated before social media existed, and continues through forces that no algorithm created. 93, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria were 3 tiny wooden boats that barely survived the Atlantic crossing through sheer audacity. Small, fragile vessels pressed into service for a desperate gamble on an unknown ocean. The Santa Maria was a standard ocean-going merchant vessel of its period, a type called a now or carrack, approximately 58 feet in length, with a displacement of around 100 tons. Not a particularly small ship by the standards of late 15th century maritime commerce. The Nina and Pinta were caravels, a ship type specifically developed by Portuguese and Spanish maritime engineers for extended ocean exploration, faster and more maneuverable than the Santa Maria, and considered by contemporary navigators to be well suited for exactly the kind of voyage Columbus was undertaking. The fleet carried provisions for approximately a year, had roughly 90 crew members distributed across all 3 vessels, and was financially backed by the Spanish crown as a formally organized expedition with commercial objectives. It was not a desperate gamble on inadequate equipment. The Santa Maria ran aground off Hispaniola on December 25th, 1492, and Columbus used its timbers to construct the first European settlement in the Americas, a building project that required the ship to have been structurally substantial. The tiny boat's framing exists to make the crossing feel more dramatically improbable than it was. Columbus's decisions are questionable for several documented reasons, but the seaworthiness of his vessels is not among them. 94. The War on Drugs was a public health initiative designed to reduce substance abuse and protect communities from the social damage associated with illegal drug use. Government acting in the interest of citizen welfare. John Ehrlichman, who served as President Nixon's domestic policy advisor and was one of the primary architects of the war on drugs as a policy framework, gave an interview in 1994 that journalist Dan Baum published in 2016. Ehrlichman stated directly that the Nixon administration knew they could not make it illegal to oppose the Vietnam War or to be black, but by associating anti-war activists with marijuana and black communities with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities and their political capacity. He confirmed explicitly that they knew they were misrepresenting the nature of the policy's objectives. Cannabis was classified as a Schedule I controlled substance, no accepted medical use, high abuse potential, despite a presidential commission recommending against criminalization in 1972. Nixon rejected the Schaefer Commission's findings and maintained the classification. The sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, set at 100 to 1 under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, was not based on pharmacological differences between the two substances, which are chemically nearly identical. The United States has the world's highest incarceration rate. One of the policy's own designers described its actual purpose on the record. The policy has continued largely unchanged. 95. Classical Latin is a dead language preserved in the texts of Cicero and Virgil, the tongue of Roman civilization, frozen at its most elevated literary expression for students to memorize and conjugate. The vast majority of Romans never spoke classical Latin in any context that resembled what is taught academically. Vulgar Latin, from vulgus, meaning common people, was the spoken vernacular of everyday Roman life, and it differed from the literary register in grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation so substantially that the two functioned as distinct registers rather than simply formal and informal versions of one language. Graffiti preserved at Pompeii by the volcanic eruption of 79 CE provides unedited samples of ordinary Roman written language, including spelling variations, slang, profanity, and grammatical shortcuts that bear little resemblance to Ciceronian prose and considerable resemblance to the early forms of the Romance languages that followed. Classical Latin pronunciation, as reconstructed and taught, was partially assembled by Renaissance scholars working from imperfect and incomplete sources. The actual sound of Roman street speech remains partially speculative even now. Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, and several other modern languages are direct descendants of Vulgar Latin. Classical Latin as a spoken language essentially ended because it was never truly the people's language to begin with, only the prestige register of an educated minority. The Latin you memorized was the dialect of the aristocracy. The language most Romans actually used became 6 countries. 96, the first heart transplant was performed by Dr. Christiaan Barnard in Cape Town on December 3, 1967. A clean historical attribution. One surgeon, one moment, medical history established. Norman Shumway at Stanford University spent approximately 10 years developing, refining, and publishing the surgical technique for orthotopic heart transplantation before Barnard performed the first human-to-human procedure. Barnard had trained using Shumway's published protocols and visited his laboratory. The foundational technical work that made the surgery reproducible was Shumway's, and the medical community understood this clearly at the time, even as public credit accumulated around Barnard. James Hardy at the University of Mississippi performed the first cardiac transplant in January 1964, replacing a dying patient's heart with a chimpanzee heart. The patient survived 90 minutes, and the medical community's response to the attempt effectively discouraged further work for several years. Barnard's patient Louis Washkansky survived 18 days following the December 1967 procedure. Not an unqualified success, but sufficient to establish proof of concept and trigger an international surgical competition that produced over 100 heart transplants worldwide within 12 months. The immunosuppression protocols that eventually made long-term cardiac transplant survival achievable were developed primarily at Stanford by Shumway's team over the years following Barnard's celebrated operation. Barnard was first, and being first in medicine carries genuine significance. What he was first to do was apply a decade of another man's published research to a human patient, which is how most celebrated firsts in science actually work when you read past the headline. 97, the Black Death was the great equalizer. Death arriving indiscriminately across the social spectrum, taking king and peasant with identical disregard for wealth or status. A democratic catastrophe that recognized no hierarchy. The Black Death killed disproportionately among the poor, the urban, and the malnourished, while the wealthy, the rural, and the well-fed survived at measurably higher rates, primarily because money could purchase the two things that most reduced plague exposure: distance and isolation. Wealthy individuals and institutions with resources to relocate to rural properties did so. The characters in Boccaccio's Decameron are explicitly wealthy Florentines who retreat to a country house outside the city specifically to wait out the epidemic, a detail Boccaccio includes because it was the observable behavior of the people around him with means to do it. The plague's transmission dynamics required proximity to infected individuals or their parasites, which meant that overcrowded urban housing and shared sleeping arrangements among the poor generated dramatically higher exposure than the private residences available to those with money. Contemporary accounts document wealthy merchants and nobility leaving cities, while the poor had no comparable option. The demographic consequence was noticed by plague-era observers at the time. In the decades following the Black Death, surviving European laborers found their wages rising due to population-reduced labor scarcity, a shift that would not have occurred if mortality had been distributed equally across economic classes. Plagues kill everyone, but they kill the poor first and in larger numbers, and they have done this consistently across every documented outbreak in recorded history. 98. The dinosaur extinction is solved. Asteroid, Yucatan Peninsula, 66 million years ago. Impact winter, mass die-off, case closed. The Chicxulub asteroid impact is strongly supported by physical evidence and widely accepted among researchers as a primary driver of the end Cretaceous extinction event. It is not considered the complete and sole explanation by the scientists who study it most closely, and the extinction was almost certainly a compounded event involving multiple simultaneous stresses on global ecosystems. The Deccan Traps volcanic complex in what is now India was actively erupting before the Chicxulub impact, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide in quantities that were already stressing global climate systems and potentially driving some extinction pressure before the asteroid arrived. Fossil evidence indicates that non-avian dinosaur diversity had been declining in the final million years before the impact, suggesting a more complex trajectory than a single sudden catastrophic event erasing a thriving population. Approximately 75% of all species went extinct during the end Cretaceous event, but which specific factor killed which specific groups remains actively debated. Small mammals, birds, freshwater species, and certain reptile lineages survived in patterns that impact-only models do not fully explain. The duration and severity of the post-impact cooling period are still being modeled with refined geological data. You know an asteroid hit, and you know the non-avian dinosaurs died. The full explanation of how those two facts connect is still being worked out by people whose job it specifically is to work it out. 600 million people watched the Apollo 11 moon landing together in July 1969. All of humanity united before their television sets, sharing a single moment of collective human achievement in real time. Television penetration in 1969 was primarily concentrated in North America, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia. The 600 million viewer figure represented a significant fraction of the television-owning portion of the world, not humanity as a whole. Global population in 1969 was approximately 3.6 billion people. If 600 million watched, that represents roughly 17% of the world's population. The remaining 83% had no access to the broadcast, found out by other means, found out significantly later, or in some cases did not receive reliable information about the event at all. Countries within the Soviet political sphere did not broadcast the moon landing live. Soviet state media initially downplayed the achievement, and many Eastern European citizens were not aware of the landing in real time through any official channel. The moon landing status as television's most watched event has been superseded multiple times since 1969 by events documented with more rigorous methodology, including the 1997 funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, estimated at approximately 2.5 billion viewers. All of humanity watched together is a sentence that accurately describes the experience of the 17% of humanity that owned a television. The other 83% found out the way people have always found out about things that happened without them. 100, the first successful powered airplane flight, was achieved by Orville Wright at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17, 1903. 12 seconds, 120 feet, the birth of aviation. At least 22 individuals made documented claims or left witness accounts of powered flight attempts before Kitty Hawk. And the two most serious competing claims involve a New Zealand farmer and a German-American inventor whose case has been formally recognized by a state legislature. Richard Pearce, a New Zealand farmer and self-taught engineer, is documented by multiple contemporaneous witnesses to have achieved a powered flight on March 31, 1903. 9 months before Kitty Hawk, though his aircraft was not fully controllable, and Pierce himself never claimed priority. Gustav Whitehead reportedly flew a powered aircraft in Bridgeport, Connecticut in August 1901, a claim disputed since the 1930s, though the state of Connecticut officially recognized it in 2013, and some aviation historians accept it. The Smithsonian Institution's long-running contractual dispute with the Wright estate over display rights created institutional incentives to protect the Kitty Hawk narrative's primacy during the decades when aviation history was being formally written. The Wright brothers' 1903 flight was 120 feet in 12 seconds. Their 1905 Flyer the 3, capable of sustained banking turns and controlled extended flight, is arguably the more meaningful technical achievement. The official birth date of aviation was partly determined by a museum custody agreement, which is how a significant number of historical firsts get their official dates. 101. History is a record of what actually happened. Events documented, verified, taught, and understood as factual accounts of the human past. History is an interpretive discipline shaped by who survived, who could write, what materials were preserved, and what political and cultural forces at various points decided was worth recording and transmitting. The vast majority of human experience before writing, approximately 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, is recoverable only through archaeology, which captures the durable and the accidentally preserved, not the typical or the subjectively significant. Literacy, printing access, and archival infrastructure have historically been controlled by the same populations that held political and economic power, which means the surviving record is systematically overrepresentative of wealthy, literate, powerful men and systematically underrepresentative of women, the poor, colonized peoples, and oral cultures whose knowledge was transmitted in forms that do not survive physical destruction. The destruction of records is itself a historical act. Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of an unknown number of Maya books in 1562. The CIA destroyed MK-Ultra files in 1973. Operation Paperclip records were sanitized before immigration processing. History textbooks in different countries describing the same 20th century events reach conclusions that are sometimes mutually irreconcilable, all presenting themselves as factual accounts. History is not what happened. It is the story of what happened, assembled by people who survived, who could write, who controlled the archives, and who had reasons to tell it the way they told it. You were handed their version and called it the record. 101 examples of why that distinction matters are now behind you. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.